Chapter 570. In truth, Jinwan had never been able to control this man, and right now Mo Jingshan was showing signs of losing control. How exactly did she provoke him tonight? Just as she was about to suffocate, Jinwan bit him heavily. She bit down hard and blood seeped out. She tasted the salty taste. The man withdrew from her mouth, but his lips remained pressed against hers. Their breaths intertwined. Her bite seemed to add a hint of bloodlust and violence to the storm-like intimacy, stirring up something buried deep in the man's bones. It was just a sexy nightgown, but it wasn't enough to make him lose his mind. However, ever since she returned from T-City 3 years ago, he hadn't been satisfied with all the things they had experienced. Once, twice, 1 year, 2 years, even 3 years. The long period of emptiness and longing had transformed into an endless desire for her. Tonight both of them were very clear-headed. He even knew the special condition of her body. He knew what he was doing, and his rationality had always been above everything else. However, the more clear-headed he was, the more he wanted her. Even if it was in a different way. In the past, no matter what stage they had reached, he had never allowed her to experience this. Mo Jingshan had always thought that he was sufficiently pure and had few desires. In the past 3 years, the occasional physical urges he experienced were only when he dreamed of her at night. Compared to other men, he had very little need for Gu Yuxing. However, every time Jinwan appeared before him, even if it was an expressionless face, even if it was just a glance toward him, back then, when he brought her to Aolan International after she was injured, only heaven knew how much restraint he had to use to resist touching her. He had to spend a lot of effort to restrain his desire for Jinwan. Jinwan, he called her name in a low and hoarse voice, holding her hand. When she tried to break free from his grip, he held her firmly and brought her hand down his body again and again. Jinwan's head was about to explode. Several times she tried desperately to withdraw her hand, but tonight, the man clearly did not intend to stop halfway. How could she escape from his grasp so easily? I originally considered that you weren't feeling well these few days, so I limited my care to you. I've already waited for 3 years, so I'm not in a hurry to wait for a few more days. Don't you think so? The man's breath was very hot, blowing against her ears. In the quiet room in the middle of the night, the man's sexy and husky voice rang out. You say I'm sanctimonious, you say I'm a refined scum. Haven't you already experienced my more refined scum side a few years ago? I know that you haven't let go of the knot in your heart, so I waited for you patiently and accompanied you. I knew that you weren't mentally prepared, so I restrained myself from hugging and kissing you. Intentionally or unintentionally, the man's lips brushed past her ears. Jinwan's entire body stiffened. But you promised that it would only be tonight. She was boasting shamelessly because she was still in those few days of the month. My current? Do you really think that I can't touch you just because you're on your period? He chuckled lowly, but it was not as cold and indifferent as usual. The longer he pressed her against the bed and kissed her, the thick, irresistible heat from his body made it impossible for her to avoid him. If you hadn't used such a method to provoke me, perhaps I would have let you off, but this result is what you deserve. Don't pull my hand. Jinwan's hand was about to melt from the heat. She trembled and tried to push him away, but one of her hands was pulled down, and the other was pressed by the side of her body. He kissed her ear. Answer me. In the few years you've been in London, have you been dressed like this every night? What did it have to do with him how she dressed? Jinwan glared at him. So what if I have? The man narrowed his eyes. It's very beautiful. Why didn't you wear it at home in the past? Jinwan, in the past, even if she wore long clothes and long pants at home, he would still strip her clean from top to bottom. Every day and night, she was bullied by this man until she could not straighten her back. How could she dare to dress like this at home? Wasn't that clearly sending herself into his mouth? It was impossible for her to even have a day of rest. How could she offend him by wearing such a nightgown? Jinwan was somewhat unhappy. She wanted to pull her hand back, but no matter how hard she tried, it was useless. At most, the sensation under her hand would become more and more obvious, and her face would turn redder from the force. Mo Jingshan, don't be so shameless, let go of my hand. There was only one wall lamp in the room. Jinwan was used to using dark lamps at night to prevent the glare from affecting her sleep. Right now she was pressed on the bed by the man. Even though she was not considered short, she always appeared petite in front of the man. Her figure was also covered by the man's tall and broad body. Only some shadows fell on her face. The light between the two of them was not obvious, but they could see each other's reflections in the other's eyes. It was dark and heavy. The atmosphere was so ambiguous that it was suffocating. The man suddenly chuckled. Right now you're the person in charge of a company. You should know that you have to be honest. If you can't do what you promised, it'll be very damaging to your reputation. The moment she finished speaking, Jinwan was kissed once again. At the same time, her hand regained its freedom. After several seconds, she slowly withdrew her hand, but her eyes were dazed as she stared at the man who was focused on kissing her. Honest my head. Was she honest? She promised to repay him with her body, but she did not really agree. Who knew that he was actually thinking about this? This man's kissing skills were the same as 3 years ago. She even suspected that in the past 3 years, when he couldn't sleep at night, he had rehearsed the scene of him kissing her again and again in his heart. She had once been kissed by this man until she was dizzy, and now, all her thoughts had almost stopped. She was kissed to the point where she almost forgot where she was. It was only when she felt a chill beneath her legs that she realized her nightgown had been lifted. The man's hand continued moving up without any obstruction until it landed on her lower abdomen. His burning palms caressed her lower abdomen. This time, the gentle caress was different from the previous time when he simply hugged her to warm her abdomen. Jinwan's hair stood on end. She was stunned for a moment and wanted to retreat, but there was nowhere to retreat. Her lips were still pressed against the man's. Apart from a few whimpers, she could not make any other sounds. Chapter 571. Right now, Jinwan's figure was even more seductive than 3 years ago. She had been exercising for a long time, and her body was no longer as weak as before. Hearing her words, the man let go of her nightgown and moved closer to her back. He had already touched the button of her underwear, and her body immediately tensed up. In fact, he had not done anything deeper, but Jinwan hated herself for being so sensitive. She hated that her body always resisted strangers and even disliked them. However, all of Mo Jingshan's hugs and touches seemed to be teasing her, causing her to lose all resistance. The moment the man easily unbuttoned her underwear, Jinwan trembled and raised her eyes, only to hear the man chuckle by her ear. Then the kiss landed on her neck and moved downwards bit by bit. When the man's kiss landed on her through the thin nightgown, Jinwan abruptly couldn't help but turn her body into a taut bow. She raised her head and bit her lips hard to resist this indescribable, almost terrifying tide of passion. The woman's neck appeared particularly seductive because she was raised. Her hair, which was neither too long nor too short, was scattered on the bed. The man's movements continued. Jinwan couldn't help but bury her head in the man's shoulder, sobbing and whispering, "Mo Jingshan, don't." She could barely stop trembling. Her body, which had not been touched by a man for 3 years, was now sensitive to his incessant touch. It was as though many of the crazy and trembling memories of the night had been stirred up. She had already softened. Even though her hands had been released, she didn't have the strength to push him away. "Don't what?" The man's naughty hands paused on her body and slowly moved down. However, he pressed down forcefully through the thing she had just changed after showering. Jinwan's entire body suddenly felt limp and she almost couldn't breathe. And in less than half a minute he was even kissing her. At a time like this, when she couldn't do anything and was separated by a white, soft thing, she was actually about to be tortured to the point of insanity. She was angry. Angry because the man knew her body like the back of his hand. Angry because she couldn't withstand his teasing. Even more angry because she hated herself for not living up to his expectations. Under his kisses and teasing, she felt that she was no different from the woman from 3 years ago who would fall under him at any time. As she was kissed dizzily by him, she suddenly felt something cold touch her hand, and all her senses instantly tightened. It was the man's belt buckle. She lowered her head and saw that his belt buckle glowed coldly in the dim room. It was so cold that she shivered. She was forcefully pulled by him to undo his belt with one hand and gripped his clothes with the other. Her eyes trembled. "Mo Jingshan," she gritted her teeth. The uncontrollable discomfort and emptiness in her body almost drowned her, but she couldn't do anything. On the other hand, the man looked at her with a heavy gaze. He firmly pressed her hand on his belt and unbuckled it with her hand. Jinwan's eyes stared at him. In the dim light, she could clearly see the man's handsome face. Even in such a lustful moment, he still appeared excessively calm. His dark, burning eyes stared at her. Only the sweat on his forehead and his breathing that was heavier than usual made him look not as calm as he seemed on the surface. Jinwan felt that she was about to go crazy. Her face was already red to the point of exploding. Damn it. Her hands were sore. Crazy. Crazy. In the end, the man held her hand tightly. His entire body was as stiff as stone, and he almost crushed her wrist. He buried his head in her neck in satisfaction and released a long, heavy breath. Jinwan finally turned her head away with a flushed face. The man's breath brushed against her neck again and again. It was very hot and very warm. After a long time he did not leave. He only held her in this position and gently kissed her ear. "It's been hard on you." Jinwan, she really wanted to say scram, but considering the man's current state, if she said anything else to provoke him, her hand would most likely be crippled here tonight. Jinwan's body stiffened and did not speak. She allowed him to press against her like this. Finally, the man's breathing gradually calmed down. However, his slightly low and hoarse voice rang by her ear. It seemed to carry a hint of inquiry. "Is it very uncomfortable?" Jinwan rolled her eyes toward the ceiling. He actually asked her if she was uncomfortable? Nonsense. It wasn't like she didn't have physical needs. In the past 3 years, not only did he live like a monk, she clearly lived like a nun, okay? It was fine if she was kissed and hugged. Women were not sensitive in this aspect. But after being teased for so long and just now, how could she not feel anything? She was stuck in this situation where she wanted to do something but could not. Instead, she had greatly satisfied him. She felt so uncomfortable that she was about to explode, okay? Jinwan's blood pressure was about to soar. She clearly remembered that Mo Jingshan was, at least on the surface, a gentleman. When the two of them were still husband and wife, they could do anything. However, she remembered the time when he was schemed against by Mo Xiaoza and was drugged and locked in the Wanli Xingchen hotel. She was afraid that he would be too uncomfortable and suggested this idea, but because he was concerned about her feelings, he did not allow her to do anything. But today, Jinwan's eyes were about to turn red. She did not know if she was torturing him or herself. Right now, he was clearly incomparably satisfied, but she did not know if she would be able to sleep tonight. Most importantly, she could not take a cold shower right now. This was really killing her. The man's kiss landed on her cheek again. He softly and warmly said, "You want it too?" Jinwan continued to roll her eyes toward the ceiling. "No." Then she heard the man's muffled laughter coming from his chest. It was low, husky, and seductive. Because he was pressed against her, the slight vibration of his chest almost stirred up her emotions. His kiss shifted to the corner of her lips. He softly said in a comforting tone, "At most, in 2 or 3 days you can start eating. At that time, I'll wash up and lie on the bed for you to do whatever you want with me." As he spoke, his handsome face leaned toward her again. He kissed her harshly on the lips. Jinwan swallowed back the angry curses she was about to say. He kissed her until she even forgot what she wanted to scold and only glared at him with a red face. Only then did he smile in satisfaction and kiss her cheek twice. Jinwan was so angry that her nerves were about to break at any moment. Who wanted him to wash up and lie on the bed? Damn it, after she got through tonight, even if this man stripped naked on her bed in the future, all she wanted to do was tie him up tightly, and then find several women to do a striptease in front of him. She insisted on letting him taste the pain of being unable to be satisfied even though his body was on fire. Did he want her to take the initiative to bed him? Chapter 572. Mo Jingshan took a shower in her room. In the end, she threw him a bathrobe and told him to quickly scram back to his own room before he finally left. Jinwan also went to take a shower. In the end, she laid on the bed. In her heart, the words, I can't sleep," echoed repeatedly. Bastard. Right now, it was already past 1 in the morning. She actually couldn't sleep. The next day, Jinwan went downstairs for breakfast with dark circles under her eyes. It was past 7 o'clock when they had breakfast. Xiaohu and Mo Jingshan were also there. Seeing Jinwan walking back and forth around the round table with a breakfast plate in her hand, Xiaohu untactfully got up to look for food and asked, "Cog, didn't you sleep well last night?" Jinwan didn't look at Xiaohu's face. Jinwan coldly glanced at him. "Do I look like I slept well?" Xiaohu was startled. "Your complexion does seem like you didn't sleep well." Furthermore, her complexion was very bad. Her tone was also very harsh, as though she was very angry. However, Xiaohu did not dare to say the latter half of his sentence. He only picked up 2 pieces of bread and dejectedly turned back to the table to sit down for breakfast. He then turned to look at Mo, who was drinking coffee and could not help but ask, Mo, it seems like Cog didn't sleep well last night. Today she has a meeting at the auditorium. Do you need me to help her sign in? Is she resting in the hotel?" "No need." Before Mo Jingshan could speak, Jinwan had already walked over with the tray. She expressionlessly spoke and then sat down. She did not even look at Mo Jingshan. Xiaohu, who had offended this ancestor this time? Wasn't she still fine yesterday? She was still in the car, and even slept on Mo's body. This night was clearly supposed to be peaceful? Why? Xiao Hu opened his mouth and watched in confusion as Jin Wan chewed hard on the toast during breakfast. He then glanced at the man by his side and softly said, "Xiaomo, it's true that a woman's mood isn't very good during these days of the month. Her mood is also unpredictable, right?" The man's expression didn't change. "Maybe I drank too much champagne last night. My mind isn't clear yet." Jin Wan immediately glared at him angrily, only to see Mo Jingshan calmly picking up his coffee cup and continuing to drink. He did not seem to be aware that he had done something naughty in her room last night. As it turned out, he had satisfied himself by relieving himself once. He felt refreshed. "I wonder who's the one who's not sober." Jin Wan no longer looked at him and rolled her eyes at the cup on the table. "If you didn't sleep well, then stay in the room for a while longer. Why did you wake up so early?" "I'm here on a business trip. I'm here for work, not to accompany a big boss on a sightseeing tour. I don't have the habit of staying in bed if I don't sleep well." Jin Wan continued to argue. Mo Jingshan furrowed his brows. "You received a painting worth 600 million yuan just by going on a business trip, and you can even receive all sorts of free and friendly services. Isn't this considered a sightseeing trip?" Jin Wan, she couldn't help but slap the knife and fork in her hand on the table. However, in order to control her temper, she grabbed the toast with her hand, as though she wanted to squash it as Mo Jingshan. However, the moment she held it in her hand, she thought of last night. The feeling that kept burning her. Jin Wan's expression turned even uglier. How could she agree to do such a thing for him? She must have drunk a few glasses at the banquet last night, so she wasn't sober enough. She didn't expect that her alcohol tolerance, which she thought had improved a lot, was still so poor. She definitely wasn't sober last night. Mo Jingshan, even if you have selfish motives, you don't have to be so brazen. If there really isn't any serious work to do in Jing City, I can return to High City at any time. Xia Tian hasn't returned to the company yet, and the people in charge of the other companies can't be the pillars of support for the time being. If I'm not in the company, our company is basically in a free-range state right now. If there's nothing serious, I'll go back first." The man's hand paused as he placed the coffee cup down. He glanced sideways at her. "In 2 days, there will be several business summits and exhibitions in Jing City, including some places arranged by the chairman of the Financial Association. You've only been in Jing City for 3 or 4 days and you can't sit still anymore?" She had already reached this stage in 3 or 4 days. If she really stayed here for half a month, wouldn't even her bones be left? Jin Wan quietly glanced at him. "I'll apply to be excluded from the list. I'll give up on all the activities in Jing City." "No." The man spoke without hesitation, not giving her any leeway at all. Jin Wan rolled her eyes at him and lowered her head to eat. Xiao Hu sat on the chair, drinking his milk as his heart trembled. It was really difficult for Mo. Usually, he never brought a woman out, nor would he bring a woman to any social events. This time he rarely brought a woman out on a business trip, but it turned out that Cog was so stubborn. Cough cough. Xiao Hu suddenly took the initiative to speak up with a smile. "Cog, you don't have to rush back to High City. The busiest time in Jing City is the first week of meetings. In 2 days, some activities arranged by the chairman of the Financial Association are more entertaining. For example, renting out a suburban villa for everyone to hold a joint queue, or renting out a resort for everyone to have fun, play cards, play ball, or go swimming. It's all very relaxing. In China, these were the ways of entertainment for these business tycoons. In fact, it was the same in London. There would often be some boss renting out a place for everyone to have fun together. Jin Wan's bowling and golf skills were all trained in the London business circle. She had long been tired of it and had no interest at all. Especially after what happened in the seaside resort in High City, she felt that the domestic business circle gatherings were meaningless. When she heard Xiao Hu mention swimming, her gaze immediately darkened. She resolutely spat out 5 words, "Even if I die, I won't go." Xiao Hu originally thought that she would relax after hearing these words. He did not expect to receive a cold rejection. Mo Jingshan coldly glanced at him. Xiao Hu was startled and immediately lowered his head to continue eating his breakfast. He originally wanted to help Big Boss win a woman's heart, but it seemed like he had done more harm than good. Mo Jingshan withdrew his gaze and looked at Jin Wan. "It's fine if you don't want to go. I'm not interested in that kind of place where the nouveau riche gather. Why don't we find a hot spring hotel and change our way of vacation for a few days?" Ha 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 ha. Hot spring hotel? Did he want to see her in a swimsuit swaying in front of him? Impossible. Absolutely impossible. Jin Wan coldly laughed and placed down the cutlery in her hands. "I'm not going." After speaking, she stood up and continued to take food from the buffet area without looking back. Chapter 573. Xiao Hu finally found a place to display his abilities. His eyes immediately lit up as he said, "Deep? How about the Blue 7-Star Hotel? It's in Jing City's Second Ring Road. It's not far from here. If there's no traffic, we can reach it in 10 minutes. Deep Blue was a very famous scenic hotel in Beijing. Other than the hot spring pool, which was the cleanest in the country, and the 7-star service, there were also some special deep-sea themed rooms. Because there was no natural sea in Beijing, the rooms were surrounded by artificial ocean scenes. This way it could satisfy the needs of people for a room with a sea view, and on the other hand, it was enough to ensure safety. Mo Jingshan tapped the table lightly with one finger. He turned to see that Jin Wan was still looking for food in the dining area. One moment she was picking up some bacon, and the next moment she was asking someone to cook a bowl of rice noodles with vegetable soup. She had no intention of returning to the table immediately. His gaze did not change as he calmly asked, "How many more days until the work in Jing City? There are still a few business partners that I have to meet personally, including the person in charge of the financial association who has connections with High City. There are also 2 that I have to attend a meeting with at the National Business Institute. COG also has a few business partners that I should meet. After all, it's rare for me to come to Jing City. Based on this, it should be over in about a week at the earliest." Xiao Hu calculated the time as he spoke. For the time being, it's most convenient to stay in Xingtang Hotel. After all, this is Shine's place. People in Jing City often hold meetings or discuss business here. It's convenient for us to do anything. As for the Blue 7-Star Hotel, after I'm done, I can stay there for 3 to 4 days. At this moment, Jin Wan had returned with the rice noodles with vegetable soup that she had asked the chef to prepare for her. When she placed the bowl on the table, she raised her eyes to see that Xiao Hu was seriously calculating the time. From time to time he would take out his work schedule to look at. She turned to see that Mo Jingshan was still calmly drinking his coffee. She pretended that nothing had happened last night and ate quietly. After breakfast, they began their journey for the day. The first place they were going to today was the exhibition venue that they had made an appointment with their partners. It was the only place that was far away from Shengtang Hotel. According to Xiao Hu, it would take 2 hours to drive there. Because the distance was too far and there would be several serious traffic jams in the middle of the road, it was possible to take more than 2 hours. Jin Wan only responded with a sound and did not say anything else. Since she did not sleep well last night, it was not bad to sleep in the car for 2 hours. In the end, Mo Jingshan clearly saw through her thoughts. She turned to meet the man's amused gaze and was instantly angered. Who was the reason she couldn't sleep well last night? In the car, Jin Wan sat in the car and leaned against the door. Seeing her blatantly keeping a distance from him, Mo Jingshan couldn't help narrowing his eyes. There's only so much space in the car. Where can you hide? Do you need me to send you another car? Jin Wan originally thought that since they were coming to Jing City, there would definitely be a car arranged for them to pick them up and send them off. However, she did not expect that Mo Jingshan would choose to keep things simple. He only had Xiao Hu drive them and did not call anyone else over. As a result, she could only sit in the same car with him every day. It would be best if you could really send me another car. Jin Wan did not refuse. The man's handsome figure was elegant and cold. He coldly glanced at her. In your dreams. Jin Wan, when you're not feeling well, you enjoy my care, eat the porridge I personally cooked for you and sit in my car. You still want to keep your distance from me, yet you want to send another car to follow behind you. Are you here on a business trip or to anger me? Jin Wan chuckled and coldly said with displeasure, you used the excuse of taking care of me to run into my room in the middle of the night. Why didn't you tell me what you did when you were taking care of me? Xiao Hu was driving. Heavens, hurry up and block his ears. This kind of flirting was very torturous, all right? The man watched her with a hint of a smile. I see that you don't reject my appearance every night. When have I not taken good care of you? Ha he he. It was very appropriate. Appropriate to the point that she did not sleep much last night. Jin Wan leaned against the car door, trying to keep as far away from him as possible. The man glanced at her. Come here. Don't sit by the car door. Don't you find it hard to lean against? I'm fine sitting here. Jin Wan stubbornly turned her head away from the window. However, the place they were going to today was really very far. Jin Wan remained leaning against the car door for nearly half an hour. In the end, she really felt that the door was hard and uncomfortable, and her back was aching from sitting in such a position. She even said that she would sleep in the car for 2 hours. What the hell would she sleep for? She couldn't sleep in this position at all. But if she continued to sit there, it would be too embarrassing. Just as she calmly raised her hand to rub her waist that was hurting from being pressed against the car door, the man's long arm reached over. He did not allow her to refuse or struggle and pulled her back. At the same time, he held her shoulders and did not allow her to move. Jinwan passively leaned into his embrace. Jinwan, Mo Jingshan pressed her into his embrace and did not release her. Even when you're so uncomfortable, you still have to hold back your temper. You'd rather keep your distance from me even if your back hurts? Do you want to sleep in my arms for a while, or do you want to continue leaning against the car door and staring out the window to exhaust the little energy you have left? Choose. Jinwan was forcefully pressed into his embrace. She struggled but could not get up. She turned to see that Xiao, who did not turn back or look at the rearview mirror, as though nothing could enter his ears. She then raised her eyes to roll them at Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan, where's your face? If I want to sleep, what position can't I sleep in? Why must I lean against your arms to sleep? Looking at his aloof and dignified manner, he did not seem to mind her sarcasm and retort at all. It was clear that he was greatly satisfied last night and was in a very good mood today. However, her mood was extremely bad. Jinwan suspected that his next sentence would be to boast about how warm and comfortable his embrace was. Thankfully he did not. As he held her, he gently patted her back that was so angry that her hair was about to stand on end. Today will be a busy day. Are you sure you don't want to sleep for a while? I'll lean against the back and sleep by myself. Jinwan's expression was stiff. She raised her hand to push the man's arm away from her shoulder. Chapter 574. Jinwan used her hand to push away his hand on her waist. She even used her nails to dig at him. Not only did Mo Jingshan not let go, but he held her even tighter. The man's indifferent voice came from above her head. Jinwan, I've already gone easy on you. Why are you still so stubborn? Jinwan immediately raised her eyes to glare at him. Afraid that Xiao Hu would hear her, she used a voice that only he could hear to say, weren't you already satisfied last night? Can't you let me sit quietly for a while? Why are you still hugging me? Let go. The man's expression was heavy. His voice was light and carried a hint of a chuckle. Who told you that I was satisfied just last night? Jinwan's originally relaxed heart instantly tensed up again. She even suspected that this man was not the Mo Jingshan she used to know. Her teeth began to itch. She gritted them and said, then what else do you want? Wasn't it enough for you to bully me last night? Could it be that you still want to? He abruptly sneered. His meaning was unclear, but it was as though he was pointing at something. When a man bullies a woman, there's never a need to use the kind of forceful method that you used last night to comfort me. You're just in a special period. I can't touch you. Be good and sleep in my arms. Don't stir up any more trouble, En? Jinwan still wanted to say something, but the man's handsome face suddenly enlarged in her vision. Realizing that he was going to kiss her in the car, her eyes almost popped out. She abruptly leaned her head back and secretly glanced at Xiao Hu, who was driving. She saw that Xiao Hu was still sitting there without turning back. He did not even glance at the rearview mirror. He was really self-aware. She did not even want to ask for help. Mo Jingshan understood Jinwan's bottom line. He could tease her as much as he wanted in private, but they were in the car and there were outsiders around. If he went too far, her temper would most likely be bad for several days. He did not kiss her in the end. He only patted her waist comfortingly. Are you sure you don't want to sleep for a while? Jinwan finally chose to push him in his arms again. When the man no longer forced her and let go of her waist, she stepped back, leaned against the back of the leather chair in the back, closed her eyes and planned to sleep like this. Then she really fell asleep just like that. Perhaps it was because he had used up some energy when he was struggling, or perhaps the sleepiness from last night had finally hit him. This time she finally fell asleep so quickly that she didn't need Mo Jingshan to hold her again. Her head tilted to the side and rested on the man's shoulder. 2 hours later, Xiao Hu stopped the car. Although Jinwan had fallen asleep, she opened her eyes when the car suddenly stopped. Her head was no longer resting on Mo Jingshan's shoulder because she had changed her position when she slept. She narrowed her eyes and looked out of the window. It was past 8 o'clock and it was almost 11 o'clock now. The sun was blazing at this time. She narrowed her eyes and looked out of the car window. Just as she was about to ask if they had arrived, she met the man's warm eyes. He didn't rush her to wake up and get out of the car. Instead, he waited patiently for her to wake up naturally. Fortunately, she was sensitive and woke up as soon as the car stopped. Otherwise, she didn't know how long she would have slept in the car. Have we arrived? She avoided the man's gaze and asked. Yes, we've arrived. COG, you've slept for more than an hour. It seems that you haven't had much rest in the hotel these days. Recently, you've been sleeping in the car, Xiaohu said very untimely. After saying that, he realized what he had just said. Looking at Jin Wan's awkward expression and Mo Jingshan's cold glance through the rearview mirror, Xiaohu's scalp went numb in an instant. Dead. He didn't mean to tease her. He just instinctively felt that COG really didn't sleep well last night. Should he explain it to her? But CO Mo's eyes were so fierce. He'd better not speak. Xiaohu scrambled out of the car. Jin Wan raised her hand and tidied her hair, which was a little messy because she had fallen asleep. Her shoulder-length hair was tied into a clean ponytail behind her head, mainly for business trips. She didn't tidy her hair every day as delicately as she usually did at home. What time will it be? She asked as she tidied up her hair. 11 o'clock. There's still 15 minutes to go. Don't worry. Mo Jingshan sat quietly by her side, watching the little woman raise her hand to take down her hairband, bite it by her lips, and then quickly tie up her hair with both hands. Hearing the time, Jin Wan was no longer in a hurry. She tidied up her hair, opened her bag, took out a lipstick that was not too dark but suitable for light makeup, and smeared it on her lips. When she rummaged in her bag for something to touch up, the man saw her cell phone in her bag. Your cell phone kept ringing when you fell asleep. Is there any news? Is there? Jin Wan picked up her cell phone, unlocked it and glanced at it. There were no messages, only a few messages from Xia Tian and recent photos of the baby in WeChat. Since Xia Tian gave birth to the baby, she had become a craze for posting pictures of the baby. Every day, not only did she post pictures of the baby to her WeChat moments, but she also sent a few more to Jin Wan. There were also 2 messages from her secretary, saying something about the company. Jin Wan glanced at them. And Xia Tian sent me a WeChat message. The man stared at her with deep eyes. WeChat. Jin Wan, who was about to put her cell phone back into her bag, paused and suddenly turned to look at the man. Don't you know what happened in the following years? You must know what's popular in China in the following years. Is WeChat very strange? The man was expressionless. I was in the United States and didn't have much contact with domestic things. Jin Wan, yes, WeChat had become particularly popular in China in recent years, and Weibo and WeChat had almost replaced QQ and other social media software in previous years. But in foreign countries, there were not many people who used it, and it was only popular in some Chinese circles and in China. No matter what stage he was in, he could only send her some messages but only some serious things. He didn't even send her a good morning or a good night, and he was even more reticent to others. Therefore, it was normal that he had never used WeChat. After all, even if his staff had helped him register a WeChat account, with his noble, cold and uncommunicative style, it was likely that he had long abandoned it and never touched it. Chapter 575. 15 minutes later, Jin Wan looked at the new WeChat friend list. No matter how she thought about it, she felt that she had been tricked by Mo Jingshan. She had already registered a WeChat friend for him, but why did he add him as a friend? Just now, when she asked him to choose a random profile picture, she searched through his phone's photo album for a long time, only to find some photos of the company's meeting documents. Not to mention selfies, there wasn't even a landscape picture. He couldn't use a photo of a meeting document as his profile picture, could he? Jin Wan said the scenery outside the car window was very good, so she asked him to take a photo outside the car window and use it as his profile picture. The man agreed, picked up his phone and took a photo outside the car window, but it wasn't his side of the car window but hers. So when the man changed his profile picture, Jin Wan clicked on the friend list and was instantly speechless. How could he take a photo of the scenery? He took a photo of her and the scenery outside the car window together. The name on the WeChat account he had just registered was still blank, and the man was not in a hurry to change his name. He just changed his profile picture and put the phone away. Jin Wan stared at the WeChat friend who had a blank name but used her photo as his profile picture and was so angry that her face turned black. It's 11 o'clock. Get out. The man got out of the car as if nothing had happened. Jin Wan, today they came to a place far from the center of Beijing to meet a few business partners. Mo Jingshan rarely visited in person, so these business partners specially chose a place to welcome him. Everyone gathered together to wait for Mo Jingshan's arrival. Jin Wan also had a few acquaintances here today, but they were not as close as Mo Jingshan to them, so she simply greeted them, exchanged business cards and chatted for a while before finding a place to sit down. Xiao Hu didn't follow Mo Jingshan to greet those partners but was told by Mo Jingshan to stay by Jinwan's side and help her whenever she needed anything. It was rare for Xiao Hu to fulfill his duty as a bodyguard. Jinwan sat there and he could do anything he wanted. Anyway, this ancestor in front of CEO Mo had such a high status, so of course he had to serve her as if she were the Empress Dowager. Jinwan was about to ask Xiao Hu to sit down and rest for a while, but before she could speak, she suddenly caught a glimpse of a figure from the corner of her eye. Her hand that was about to touch the glass paused and turned to look in that direction. After Mo Jingshan had decided on his itinerary in Jing City, Rong Yin had inquired about his itinerary these days and knew where he would go. Last night, she didn't get a chance to talk to Mo Jingshan at the banquet and the charity auction. Although she could see that Mo Jingshan really had no feelings for her and seemed to really love that Jinwan, she couldn't accept it and sneaked out of home early. After all, she was the second daughter of a wealthy family in Jing City. No one dared to stop her if she wanted to come here. Seeing that Mo Jingshan had just talked with someone, Rong Yin came out of the lounge behind and walked up to him. Mr. Mo Jingshan was not surprised to see her here again. He just looked at her indifferently. He heard her but didn't respond. Did you come alone today? Rong Yin had been standing behind him and couldn't see what was going on in front of the door. It took her a long time to notice Mo Jingshan in the crowd, only to see that he didn't bring the woman named Jinwan with him today. But she didn't know what he was thinking, so she didn't dare to ask why Jinwan didn't come with him today. Mo Jingshan's indifferent gaze landed on her. His pitch-black eyes were cold and emotionless. Second Miss Rong indeed has the capital to do as she pleases in Jing City. However, today's venue is not a banquet hall. Most of the people here are capitalistic businessmen, and the topics discussed here are all business matters. I'm afraid you've come to the wrong place. Rong Yin smiled bitterly. You must know why I'm here. I've been strictly controlled by my family since I was a child. It's rare for me to come back to China after graduation and rebel, but I didn't expect that I'd come to nothing. Mr. Mo, I don't mean anything else. I just want to ask, what's so bad about me that you don't even bother to look at me? Mo Jingshan didn't speak. This man had a kind of indifference that made people tremble in fear. Even though she was the famous second daughter of the Rong family in the capital circle, she could only choose to be silent in front of him. She didn't have the slightest temper of a rich young lady. His indifference seemed to be able to spread everywhere, making her not even the slightest impulse to hug him or the courage to be shameless. Because she knew that the more she pestered him, the less he liked her. But when he glanced at her so coldly, she couldn't help but want to step back, but she held back. Am I not beautiful enough? My family background is not good enough? My education is not high enough? Or do you hate me because I'm too arrogant and domineering? I think I'm very gentle, at least in front of Alien, and I'm rarely hated, but from the beginning to the present, you've never looked at me. I know, Mr. Mo, you've seen a lot of good women, but in this country, I'm confident that only the Rong family can match your family background. Even if you don't care about these things, you didn't have any other women around you in the past few years. Why can't you treat me? Mo Jingshan's eyes and voice were indifferent. Miss Rong, you've investigated me for so long. Don't you know that I've been married? Rong Yan's expression froze. She really didn't find out his past. Besides, Mo Jingshan's past was not something that anyone could easily find out. She had asked someone to help her investigate for so long, but they could only find out some superficial things. There were many things she wanted to know about his past, but she could not find out anything about it. You are married? Rong Yin couldn't believe it. Mo Jingshan's thin lips turned up slightly. He chuckled and glanced at the seat where Jinwan was sitting. Rong Yin followed his gaze and looked in that direction. The moment she saw Jinwan again, she suddenly understood everything. Even though there were still many things she didn't know, it seemed like she wasn't qualified to know. She pursed her lips, feeling very uncomfortable in her heart. Her face was also a little embarrassed, but when the words came to her mouth she could only say, "Sorry? I was rude." With that, she turned and left, not staying any longer, nor did she have the face to stay any longer. When Rong Yin left, Mo Jingshan returned to Jinwan's side and sat down. Suddenly, he heard the little woman playing with a glass of water and asking, "Why don't you continue chatting with your Rong Yin? Why are you sitting here?" Chapter 576. Jinwan said indifferently, "I don't care who she is. You don't need to explain to me." The man glanced sideways at her. "You're so jealous. Don't try to cover it up." Jinwan glanced at him. "Why do I look like I'm jealous?" "You look like you are." She looked expressionlessly at the crowd. Your Rong Yen is still there. Why did you ignore her after just a few words? On this occasion, she obviously came especially for you. After a pause she added, and she's still looking at you. The man looked at her again, then turned his head to look at Rong Yen, who was still looking at him in the crowd, and said casually, she's just observing my relationship with you. Jinwan raised her eyebrows. What did you say to her? I said I'm married. Jinwan, she put the glass in her hand on the table and said coldly, you've already divorced. Why are you still talking about marriage? Are you using me as a shield? What are you thinking? Mo Jingshan said lightly, not to mention that you're married. Do you want her to continue to pester you with endless hope, or do you want the Rong family to target you? Jinwan sneered. Then should I thank you for helping me avoid so many troubles in this way? The Rong family is not so unreasonable. Although Rong Cheng did go a bit too far, I think the Rong family cares more about their reputation and won't resort to such despicable means. At this moment, other partners took the initiative to come over and talk to Mo Jingshan, as if they couldn't wait to say something to Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan's face didn't change at all. He just grunted, casually greeted them, and still sat opposite Jinwan, not avoiding her at all. At this time, some partners of MN Group happened to be nearby, so Jinwan got up to talk to them and didn't continue to sit here. The people around Mo Jingshan had left, but Jinwan still hadn't come back. Mo Jingshan sat quietly in his seat and saw Jinwan fluttering among the partners like a butterfly. Her every frown and smile was so charming. From time to time she took a glass of red wine and clinked glasses with those people. From time to time she would take a document handed over by a partner and read it, and then she would continue to talk to them with a smile. The business world was comparable to a social arena. Today Jinwan could still see some traces of her past coquettishness in private, but when she was at work or socializing she was like a fully armed female warrior, and a smiling female warrior at that. Jinwan hadn't come back yet, and Mo Jingshan was not in a hurry to call her. Looking at her figure over there, he remembered something and took out his cell phone to take a look. He opened the WeChat account that Jinwan had just set up for him, looked at his profile picture, smiled, and clicked on Jinwan's WeChat moments. Jinwan had been using WeChat for almost a year, but she had only posted a few posts on WeChat moments. The first one was a picture of the night sky in London taken by her cell phone. There was only one picture of the night sky and nothing was written on it. The second one was 2 months later. It was a picture of the messy desk full of documents in her office in London, accompanied by a hard-working emoji and 3 words, the third year. The third one was a picture of her hands and the hands of 2 other girls. Each hand stretched out in a V shape to form a 5-pointed star. Jinwan wrote on the photo, it's rare for me to come out for an outing and breathe the fresh air. Why are Feng Ling's and Xiao Ba's hands whiter than mine? I'm not convinced. I'm calling Xia Tian, who is suntan in High City. Come quickly. Aggrieved. After that there were a few retweets of London financial reports and a chicken soup about workplace beliefs and so on. Then she didn't post any more posts on WeChat moments before returning to China. After returning to China, her WeChat moments were all blank except for a bird's eye view taken from the top floor of the Xingtang Hotel in Beijing 2 days ago, accompanied by a line of text. This business trip is really painful. Before that, during the period after returning to China, she didn't post a word or a photo. Whether it was the first time she met him after returning to China, or where they met again, or the gradual change in their relationship, she didn't say a word. It seemed that her heart was not disturbed at all. The man couldn't help frowning. Her WeChat moments were all about work, career, or friendship. He should be glad that she didn't mention any man, but at the same time she didn't mention himself, not even a little emotional. Mo Jingshan looked at her WeChat moments again and made sure that he didn't miss a single one. There was indeed no trace of him. The man put down his cell phone and looked expressionlessly at Jinwan, who had come back. Jinwan had just said too much and was a little thirsty. Xiao Hu quickly put a glass of juice on the table in front of Jinwan. Jinwan came over and took a sip. Then she took the cooperation plan she had just received from a partner and sat on the table to read it. After reading for a while, she suddenly felt the air around her was a little depressed. She raised her hand and took another sip of juice. When she looked up, she saw that Mo Jingshan was looking at her deeply. She said, "Why are you looking at me? Didn't you come to work today? CEO Mo seems to be very free." "COG, even you didn't pay much attention to our CEO Mo when he was busy. Just now there were a lot of people pestering him. It's rare for him to come here and sit quietly for a while. In this kind of formal social event, everyone acts according to the mood. It's obvious that COMO is resting here, so not many people dare to come over and talk, Xiaohu chimed in. Oh, it was because Boss Missouri didn't need to put on airs here. Just sitting here, people consciously gave him time to rest and no one dared to come over. Sure enough, different people were different. She still had to get up to chat and laugh with those partners or some bosses who were developing cooperative relationships, and then she had to come over with the cooperation plan. He just needed to sit here quietly and let others worship and respect him. She came to work to discuss this kind of thing and he came to work to just wait for the person to arrive. But why did he keep staring at her? They had been together from morning to night these days. Hadn't he got tired of looking at her? Jinwan ignored him, lowered her head to continue to read the documents at hand, and took out a pen from her bag to carefully mark the problems in the cooperation plan in red circles. Seeing Jinwan working so seriously, Mo Jingshan didn't speak but just looked at the woman who was immersed in her work and didn't take him seriously at all. Chapter 577. For the next 2 to 3 days they entered a busy work phase. Jinwan's period of discomfort had finally passed. She could now go to work and socialize with all her might. She attended all sorts of meetings, exhibitions and other matters. On this trip to Jing City, the only major mistake she made was to believe Mo Jingshan's words. He said that there was no need to bring an assistant or secretary. As a result, she had to do everything personally. Of course, Mo Jingshan did not call Shenmu over. Instead he brought Xiaohu over. Clearly most of the time Xiaohu was treated as their chauffeur or housekeeper. All sorts of miscellaneous tasks were handled by Xiaohu. As for the other matters, Mo Jingshan rarely did them personally. For the past 2 days she had been so busy that she did not have any free time. Every day she would only return to the hotel after 10 o'clock at night. She would drag her tired body and take a shower before falling into a deep sleep. In the past few years the property market in the country had been on the rise. This time, there was a construction exhibition in Jing City that was jointly organized by the nation's property companies. All the major property companies in the country had been invited to participate. Although MN Group was diversified, it was still founded on property. Thus, it was also one of the invited names. Mo Jingshan was also invited, but at the same time he had a more important meeting to attend. Thus, Mo Jingshan left Xiaohu by Jinwan's side and had Xiaohu accompany her to attend the construction exhibition. After arriving at the exhibition hall, Xiaohu eagerly helped Jinwan with various matters. He went in first to make arrangements and then came out. "Cog, I found a seat for you. You can sit down for the entire exhibition. You can also sit with the people in charge of BGY Group. I heard that BGY Group has been in contact with your company for the past few years. This way, it'll be more convenient for you to talk while looking at the architectural models." "Are BGY's people here as well?" "That's right. For an exhibition like this to be held in Jing City, a large property company like BGY will definitely have a spot." Jinwan nodded and walked in. Today's exhibition was mostly about the physical models of various landmarks in the country, as well as some buildings that sold particularly well and had referential prices. In the exhibition hall, there was a huge map with the names of each city and model marked. Among them there were 4 models in High City. Shine Group currently did not specialize in the real estate industry. Although Mo Jingshan was also invited, Shine Group's buildings were not among the models. Instead, there were 2 from BGY Group and 2 from High City's newest real estate companies. MN Group's buildings were also not among them. This thing was actually a representation, nothing more than an exhibition and introduction. After Jinwan went in, she greeted several familiar people from High City. Xiaohu pointed her to the seats that had been arranged. She nodded and walked over there. When she first arrived, she did not pay much attention to the people nearby. All of a sudden she heard a familiar male voice. "Jinwan?" She couldn't help but stop in her tracks. She turned around abruptly and saw Mr. Vince, whom she hadn't seen for a long time, walking to the seat next to her with Secretary Yang, who was always with him. Jinwan looked at Mr. Vince and then at his seat, which was next to hers. "Jinwan, this was the seat arranged by Xiaohu? He was innocent, wasn't he?" If Mo Jingshan were to find out, she wasn't sure if Xiaohu would still be able to keep his job. "Why are you in Jing City?" Before Jinwan could speak, Mr. Vince had seen the nameplate of the seat next to his and turned to look at her, asking at the same time. I'm here on a business trip. I've been in Jing City for several days. Haven't you been back to High City recently?" Jinwan sat down first. Seeing that she had sat down, Mr. Vince gave a faint smile, motioned for Secretary Yang to go to his seat, and then sat in the seat closest to Jinwan. I haven't been back to High City for some time. I received an exhibition notice in Jing City, so I flew over early this morning. Mr. Vince said as he opened the bottle of mineral water on the table for her and handed it to her. I haven't seen you for some time. How have you been? If someone else had asked this question, it would have been a polite greeting, but coming from Mr. Vince's mouth, Jinwan knew that he really wanted to ask how she was doing recently. She took the water and smiled. I'm fine. I've been busy these days, so I fell asleep as soon as I went back to the hotel. I slept well at night and was in good spirits during the day. The new projects and collaborations I've been talking about have all gone well. Hearing her words, Mr. Vince smiled. Why do you look so pale? Jinwan noticed that Mr. Vince's face was thinner and paler than before. A few days ago, I had a gathering with some old classmates who came back from abroad. I haven't had a gathering for many years. It's rare for us to get together, so I drank too much and hurt my stomach. It's all right. I'll be fine after resting for a while. Mr. Vince smiled mildly because of her relationship with him. After all, I'm no longer a young man in my teens or 20s. I'm in my 30s. I should control my drinking. Otherwise, it's easy for me to drink too much and hurt my body. Hearing that he hurt his stomach because of drinking, Jinwan couldn't help but be slightly surprised. I always thought you could hold your liquor well. Yes, I could. Mr. Vince smiled. But no matter how good your drinking capacity is, you can't try mixing red, white, and beer all night without stopping? Jinwan nodded. I don't dare to try that. You know, no matter how good my drinking capacity was when I was in London, I can't even hold 2 bottles of wine. If I mix white and red, I'll probably collapse after a few glasses. Mr. Vince chuckled. You better forget it. There's no need for a girl to drink so much. Usually, you secretly pour away a lot at the table. Don't think I didn't see it. There were several times when Jinwan met Mr. Vince at the table, but she didn't expect him to see all of her little actions. She couldn't help but chuckle. Looks like I need to practice my technique of secretly pouring wine. You saw it, so did everyone else. If everyone knows it and I still pretend to drink to my heart's content, how awkward would that be? As she spoke, Xiaohu approached from behind. The seat Xiaohu had arranged for him was right behind Jinwan. He noticed that Jinwan and this BGY representative were chatting happily and seemed to be very familiar with each other. When they were chatting, their bodies were leaning closer to each other, as though they were whispering with their heads lowered. Chapter 578. Usually COG would never take the initiative to lean so close to COMO, nor did she smile so warmly. However, she appeared to be chatting passionately with this BGY's general manager. He did not hear what COG said, but all Xiaohu saw from behind was the two of them smiling at each other. COG ah. Xiaohu suddenly stood up, tilting his head forward to say, COMO said that after the exhibition ends, I'll send you to his place. Tonight, you can return to the hotel together. Jinwan paused at Xiaohu's abrupt words. She turned to glance at Xiaohu, but Xiaohu immediately retracted his head and returned to his original seat with a vexed expression. Was it wrong to arrange for COG to be with BGY's people? Mr. Vince heard the words of the person behind Jinwan and maintained a faint smile on his face. He did not speak and lowered his head to open another bottle of mineral water. Mo Jingshan was also in Jing City? Returning to the hotel together? After opening the bottle, Mr. Vince placed the bottle on the table and did not speak further. However, his forehead suddenly felt a cool and soft touch. He paused, watching Jinwan, who had suddenly placed her hand on his forehead. Jinwan's hand was not cold, but when it was placed on his forehead, it felt slightly cold. I already said that your complexion doesn't look too good. Not only is your stomach not feeling well, you're also running a fever, aren't you? Are you working despite your illness? The woman's hand was soft as though it had no bones. She placed it on his forehead for a while before placing it down. Mr. Vince sat in his original position without moving or speaking. There seemed to be a lingering sensation on his forehead. Jinwan first touched her own bag. I don't have the habit of carrying cold medicine or fever medicine with me. Did your secretary bring it? Doesn't the secretary know that you're running a fever? It's quite hot to the touch. Mr. Vince's gaze paused on her face. His eyes, which had become much lighter due to Mo Jingshan's presence, continuously darkened and deepened bit by bit. Jinwan didn't notice his strangeness and was still concerned about his physical condition. You can't work when you're sick. A few days ago when I wasn't feeling well, I tried to rest in the hotel. I occasionally came out for a walk, but I often sat down. When the exhibition is over, go back to rest. Don't neglect your health. When I arrived in Beijing this morning, I felt uncomfortable and sleepy as soon as I got off the plane. If you hadn't mentioned it, I wouldn't have realized that I had a fever." Mr. Vince smiled. "It's okay. I'll go back early after I'm done here. Don't worry." Jinwan nodded. Seeing that a grown man like him would not be affected by a fever, she did not speak further. She signaled with her eyes for him to pick up the bottle of mineral water he had just opened on the table to drink. Her meaning was for him to drink more water. Drinking more water during a fever would help him sweat. When the exhibition began, Jinwan watched and listened for a while. She felt that it was pointless and inadvertently noticed that Mr. Vince had been watching intently the entire time. He did not have any relationship with any of BGY's senior management. He had relied solely on his education and years of work experience to secure his position as the general manager. It was clear how dedicated he was. She picked up her phone and glanced at it. She recalled that she had previously added Qin Sighting on WeChat. However, after the previous incident, it was inappropriate for her to directly ask Qin Sighting about it. Thus, she decided to post a message in her circle of friends. "Will stomach discomfort cause a fever? Is the situation serious?" After sending the message, she placed her phone down. Several minutes later, she remembered and picked up her phone to take a look. There were several comments. Several employees and Xiao Ba in the company were asking if her stomach was uncomfortable and if it was serious. Xia Tian sent a bunch of question marks. "What's wrong with you?" Qin Sighting's comment was at the bottom. "Gastroenteritis can indeed cause a fever. Usually it refers to acute gastroenteritis. There will be symptoms of fever and vomiting. It needs to be treated with antibiotics and related drugs. It's not a serious illness, but if it causes a fever, it means that the inflammation is serious. It's best to be hospitalized for treatment." Jinwan replied to him, smiley face, "Worship, as expected of a doctor. The way you speak is like Baidu Wikipedia." However, just as Jinwan lowered her head to look at the comments, Xiao Hu, who was seated at the back, was already bombarded by his boss's phone call. "Hello, COMO." Xiao Hu trembled as he answered the call. He did not know why COMO would suddenly call him when he was busy. "Jinwan's stomach is uncomfortable? And she has a fever?" Mo Jingshan asked. "No." Xiao Hu was dumbfounded. He raised his eyes to look at Jinwan, who was currently scrolling through her phone with her head lowered. She pursed her lips and appeared to be fine. "COG seems to be in good condition. She doesn't seem sick at all." Mo Jingshan was silent for a moment on the other end of the line. He suddenly asked in a heavy voice, "Who's by her side right now?" "There aren't many people. They're all big bosses from various companies who were invited to the exhibition hall today." Xiao Hu's words were somewhat vague. He was unsure if this BGY's general manager was familiar with COG. He was unsure if he had arranged this seat wrongly. After hesitating for a long time, he finally said, "The person in front of her is the manager of the exhibition hall. Behind her is me. To her left is the manager of a real estate company called Lu Cheng, which has a partnership with MN Group. To her right is the manager of BGY Group, which has a partnership with MN Group." Mo Jingshan had just left the meeting hall. When he heard the words Biju, his footsteps paused. He raised his head to look at the parking lot in the distance, narrowing his eyes as he coldly spoke. "BGY's manager? Their local general manager, Vince?" "Oh, that's right. COMO, didn't you not come? How did you know?" Xiao Hu felt a chill run down his spine from Mo Jingshan's tone. "But it seems like Mr. Vince is the one who isn't feeling well. It seems like his mental state isn't very good." Mo Jingshan's expression did not reveal anything. He only calmly said, "I'll be there in a moment." "All right, COMO." After hanging up, Mo Jingshan opened up Jinwan's circle of friends. He saw that the night before yesterday, Qin Sighting had added Jinwan after discovering their WeChat contacts. He then saw Jinwan's reply. "Very good." The first post was related to a man, but it was posted for another man. Below it was her interaction with another man. Mo Jingshan read Jinwan's post over and over again. He then read her conversation with Qin Sighting over and over again. His brows furrowed, and his expression became increasingly expressionless. Chapter 579. Seeing Qin Sighting's comment, Jinwan knew that he was not busy right now and had time to talk, so she sent a message to Qin Sighting and asked him about the gastroenteritis and fever. Then she said a few polite words. She put down the phone. Less than half an hour later, Mo Jingshan called. She had not saved Mo Jingshan's number in her contacts. She had not saved it since she returned to China. Jinwan looked at the number on her phone that she had memorized without saving it in her contacts and picked it up. The man's voice came through. Is the exhibition over? Not yet. It'll probably be another hour. And? Jinwan heard his tone again and glanced at the quiet crowd around her. She lowered her voice to say, It's not convenient for me to answer the phone here. Did you call just to tell me, N? The man said indifferently, Look ahead to the right. Jinwan paused and raised her eyes to look in the direction he pointed. She first saw the exhibition stand and then turned to the right. All of a sudden, she saw a man dressed in a black suit standing in the unobtrusive resting area by the side of the exhibition stand. Jinwan, when did this man come over? Didn't he say that he had a meeting today, so he asked Xiaohu to accompany her here and look for him later? Why did he come to the exhibition hall? Since Mo Jingshan was standing there, it was clear that the people here recognized him and did not dare to stop him. However, there were no seats here, so they opened the door by the side of the stand and let him sit there so that he could look at the exhibition stand from a close distance. However, it was clear that the man had no intention of looking at the exhibition stand. Instead, he indifferently looked in her direction through the small crowd. Most importantly, the man's expression was not very good. Especially when he saw Mr. Vince, who was sitting next to her slightly because he was not feeling well and his head was almost leaning toward her, Mo Jingshan's expression became even colder and more indifferent. Sensing that Jinwan was sitting next to him, Mr. Vince, who was originally fine, suddenly seemed to have a slight change in his mood. Mr. Vince was the closest to her. As Mo Jingshan was standing behind the lights, he could not see him clearly without looking carefully. He only glanced at the exhibition stand and then turned to look at her. What are you looking at? Jinwan's expression was calm. Nothing. She felt that he seemed a little weak just now, so she turned her eyes and said, I just asked a friend who is a doctor. He said that it's best to go to the hospital for a fever caused by gastroenteritis. If it's serious, you'll have to be treated in the hospital for 2 days. You can't force yourself like this. Mr. Vince smiled faintly. Well, if it's not done in 2 days, I'll go and take a look. You're already running a fever and you still want to wait until you're done. You'd better go there after we leave the exhibition hall. Mo Jingshan stood in the distance. Seeing Jinwan whispering to the man next to her and speaking very seriously, his face gradually darkened. From the moment he came in, he saw the two of them sitting together. The little woman who usually frowned at him often smiled at the man who often went to London for the past 3 years to make his presence known in front of her. She had even posted a post on her WeChat moments just for this man. The exhibition had reached an important period. The person on stage had also reached an important part. Jinwan's gaze returned to the exhibition stand. She did not look at anyone. After she finished looking through this part of the exhibition, the models and pictures on the display stand and the large screen in front of her had all been changed. She lowered her eyes to look at her phone. After looking at her hand for a while, she seemed to remember that Mo Jingshan had come earlier. She raised her eyes again, only to see that the man who had been standing in the dark by the side of the exhibition stand had disappeared. Jinwan's gaze faltered. Did he leave because he had something to do? She retracted her gaze and continued to look at the exhibition stand. After several minutes, the person in charge of Lu Qing Group, who was sitting on her left, stood up to go to the restroom. Several minutes later, someone returned and sat by her side. Jinwan did not pay much attention to it at first because the lighting in the exhibition hall was dim. However, she suddenly felt a sense of familiarity by her side. It also carried a clear and heavy aura, causing her to abruptly turn her head. She first lowered her eyes to see a pair of long legs dressed in black trousers. Her gaze then moved up bit by bit. She saw a black shirt and a suit jacket casually placed by the side. She continued moving up to see a shirt with 2 or 3 buttons undone. A man's seductive collarbone, Adam's apple, and a well-defined and incomparably handsome chin. When she met Mo Jingshan's gaze, Jinwan instantly pursed her lips. She could not help but look in the direction beside him and then in another direction. Her expression was strange. Isn't this the seat of the person in charge of Lu Qing Group? You sit here. When he comes back, where should he sit? Seeing her slow reaction and the fact that she could not find the main topic on him, Mo Jingshan was expressionless. You're really concerned about a lot of people. I've asked someone to arrange a VIP seat for him in the front row. Jinwan made an "oh" sound and retracted her gaze. She continued to look at the exhibition stand and did not pay him any attention. The surroundings were very quiet. Everyone was basically whispering a few words before continuing to listen patiently to the explanation on the exhibition stand. Mo Jingshan did not speak further and only sat by Jinwan's side. All of a sudden Jean Wan's right hand was covered by a hand. She turned to look at Mr. Vince, who was seated to her right. Mr. Vince leaned over and whispered into her ear, "Look at the model on display right now. It's the overall concept model of several European-style villas that BGY plans to introduce nationwide this year. Our company plans to promote this type of residential area in various cities. What do you think of the design of these villas?" Mr. Vince was not trying to take advantage of her. He had only placed his hand on Jean Wan's hand to attract her attention. She tried to draw her attention back, but when he saw that Jean Wan's hand did not move away, nor did she make any movements to push him away, Mr. Vince did not move his hand away and continued to place it on hers as though it was natural. Jean Wan's gaze shifted to the new set of architectural models and detailed drawings on the screen that Mr. Vince had mentioned. She found them somewhat familiar. Weren't these the architectural models of BGY's luxurious villas that many wealthy people in the country had been particularly fond of in recent years? She did not expect that BGY would only begin to promote and design these now. She felt as though she had stepped onto a point in history. Jean Wan smiled. Before she could speak, she abruptly felt the air pressure on her left drop to the point where many people around her felt as though they were about to freeze. Chapter 580. When Mo Jingshin spoke, the anger on his face was unprecedentedly clear, and anyone could see that he was angry. Hearing this, Jean Wan immediately wanted to take her hand back, but she suddenly felt a sharp pain in her wrist. She turned to look at the man who had pulled her wrist out first and met his black eyes. His eyes, which were usually deep and indifferent, were now a deep sea of fire. He stared at her as if to burn her, and every line of his face was tense. It was clear that he was angry and enduring. Jean Wan had never seen Mo Jingshin so directly angry, nor did she see him angry. It was almost the first time that he was so angry. Her heart shrank slightly and she frowned. "It hurts?" Mo Jingshin looked at her wrinkled face and realized how hard he had held her wrist just now. He let go of her wrist, but his face was expressionless and cold as if ice was about to form. Mr. Vince was not feeling well today, so his attention was not as sharp as usual. When Jean Wan vaguely said the word, "It hurts," he turned to look at the man on the other side of her. The two men looked at each other. One was slightly startled and the other was cold and indifferent. There was an indescribable undercurrent in their eyes at the same time. Jean Wan was talking to Mr. Vince. Because he was not feeling well today, she leaned closer to him to avoid his voice being lower than usual. Besides, he was just talking to her about the building models, so she was only slightly sensitive to the hand that suddenly covered hers. However, because she felt that Mr. Vince was having a fever and his palm was obviously hot, she hesitated and did not move her hand away. It had only been less than a minute since their hands touched. She didn't expect that Mo Jingshin, who was usually expressionless, would be clearly angry. "Xiaomo?" Mr. Vince spoke first. When he saw that Mo Jingshin had sat down next to Jean Wan, he understood what was going on. However, Jean Wan's concern for him just now made him want to give up again. He suddenly made up his mind to cut off all means of retreat. Even if the person he had to fight against was Mo Jingshin, he didn't intend to give up so easily. So Mr. Vince's voice sounded polite, but it was full of emotions that only Mo Jingshin could understand. Now he knew that the relationship between Jean Wan and Mo Jingshin had not recovered to that extent. He wouldn't say anything about what happened in Yuehu Bay, but since Jean Wan hadn't remarried him or made up with him, it meant that he still had a chance. Mo Jingshin didn't speak, not even a word of response, but just glanced at him indifferently. The two men sitting next to her were both about 1.8 meters tall. Their figures were almost perfect, and they were both dressed in expensive and exquisite formal suits. Furthermore, they were both black. Although Mr. Vince's background was slightly simpler, and his status as BGY's general manager was not as shocking as his status as Shine Group's global CEO, he was actually an elite in every aspect. In front of Mo Jingshin, he did not show the slightest bit of timidity. The two men both exuded a cold and aloof aura. More importantly, the two men sat on her left and right, sandwiching her between them. Strangely, Jean Wan felt that her current situation was almost comparable to the Shiraba. In the past few years, the way she interacted with Mr. Vince was not very deliberate. Instead, it was very natural. When she first returned to the country, the person she interacted with the most was Mr. Vince. However, in Mo Jingshin's eyes, this kind of relationship was not the same. Mo Jingshin was the first to indifferently withdraw his gaze. When the guide on the stage announced that the exhibition would end here, he took Jean Wan's hand and stood up to leave. The moment Jean Wan's figure was forced to stand up with him, Mr. Vince said with a faint smile, Shine Group's headquarters is still in Los Angeles. In the past few years, COMO hasn't returned to the country much. This time you seem to have stayed in the country for too long. Is this also moving the company's headquarters back to the country? Mo Jingshan paused and said indifferently, Mon Group's headquarters has been moved back to the country. Why can't Shine Group be moved back? Jinwan? Mon Group? She had clearly changed its name to MN Group, but he actually insisted on calling it Mon. Mr. Vince glanced sideways at Jinwan. Seeing that Jinwan pursed her lips and obviously had no intention of cooperating with Mo Jingshan, he gave a playful smile. Mon? Why do I remember that when she registered the company name in London, her mentor said that she could use her original name, but she insisted on changing it to MN. Originally she wanted to use other letters, but in order to make it easier to remember she used the two letters MN. This has nothing to do with Mon. Jinwan, Mr. Vince was not in High City before. She had thought that he didn't approach her because of Mo Jingshan, but now it seemed that it was not the case. His tone clearly sounded to be against Mo Jingshan, and he had no intention of being suppressed by Mo Jingshan's momentum at all. Jinwan could clearly smell the smoke of gunpowder. Mo Jingshan held Jinwan's hand, put his arm around her waist, and quietly tightened his grip on her waist. He sneered and said calmly, "Do you think Mon doesn't exist just because MN has replaced Mon?" A few months ago the British media and the domestic media had interviewed her and asked her about the purpose of MN. She had said that she just wanted to continue the name of her original studio, but had changed it to letters in order to conform to international standards. Was the interview she had given herself more reliable, or was your words worth my time and consideration? Or perhaps you can only find some comfort in these words? Mr. Vince's face changed slightly and darkened. Mo Jingshan put his arm around her and went out. This time Mr. Vince did not speak again. Jinwan wanted to say something for Mr. Vince, but thinking that he was not evenly matched with Mo Jingshan, she knew that whatever she said now would not do him any good. But before walking out of Mr. Vince's sight, she quietly looked back at him and raised her hand to point to her stomach, reminding him to remember to go to the hospital. Seeing that Jinwan was still winking at Vince, Mo Jingshan took her out of the exhibition hall and let her go. He didn't say a word and didn't even look at her, let alone lower his head to talk to her intimately. Chapter 581. She glanced at him. We only sat together and chatted. What's wrong with touching hands? Is there a need to be so impolite to me? The man ignored her and went to the security guard in the parking lot to receive the electronic car key. He asked coldly, "Where did you park it?" The security guard said respectfully, "Sir, your car was parked in parking lot number 208 on the B2 floor." Mo Jingshan went down the stairs of the parking lot. Jinwan turned to look at Xiao Hu, who had followed her out. Although Xiao Hu did not understand the situation, he felt that he could not protect himself and did not speak much. When his eyes met Jinwan's, he quickly turned his head away. He followed Mo Jingshan's back and called out eagerly, "COMO." When they reached the car, Mo Jingshan sat in the back. Even after Jinwan got into the car, he did not acknowledge her or look her in the eye. He lowered his head to pick up the documents on the back seat and read through them. His expression was still cold and unpleasant. He did not speak, nor did Jinwan. The man's slender fingers flipped through the documents in his hands, treating her as though she did not exist. Xiao Hu glanced at the time as he drove and then boldly spoke up in the overly quiet atmosphere in the car. "COMO, the exhibition ended early this morning. Do you want to continue with your afternoon schedule? Or do you want to return to the hotel? It's already past 12. You and COG haven't had lunch yet. Do you want to find a place to eat first?" "All right." Jinwan readily agreed. Coincidentally, she was hungry. The man did not move his eyes. He indifferently watched her expression as though she was in high spirits the moment she heard that they were going to eat. He coldly said, "Whatever." Seeing that he was willing to speak, Jinwan finally turned to look at him. "Are we going to eat Chinese food or Western food?" Mo Jingshan silently watched her calm expression as though nothing had happened. His gaze was cold and he did not say a word. Jinwan very consciously turned her eyes away from him and made a decision. "I've been eating Chinese food for the past few days. I haven't seen any particularly good Chinese food in Jing City. Let's eat Western food today." Seeing that COMO did not speak, Xiao Hu continued to drive in search of a good Western restaurant nearby. When they arrived at the restaurant, Jinwan handed the menu to them to order. Mo Jingshan tossed the menu to Xiao Hu, asking him to order. Xiao Hu continued to tremble. Well, COMO, although I understand your taste, I really don't know COG's taste very well. Why don't you two order some? Jinwan had no intention of taking the menu. Anyway, she would just eat casually. She gave Xiaohu a look indicating for him to pass the menu to Mo Jingshan. Mo Jingshan had no intention of accepting it. The man casually said, "Order whatever you want to eat." I don't even understand how you look at men now, so how would I know what you like to eat? Jinwan, what does that mean? Was he implying that her attitude towards Mr. Vince was slightly better now, and mocking her for her poor taste in men? Xiaohu, was COMO jealous? Today's seat was arranged. It's relatively close, and Mr. Vince has taken good care of me these past few years. There's nothing wrong with talking to him. Furthermore, Mr. Vince has pursued me for more than 3 years. We're both adults and there's nothing between us. At most we'll touch hands and talk. Is there a need for me to be so unreasonable? Mo Jingshan silently watched her, his gaze cold. Xiao, who had already slowly stood up. He felt that this topic was not suitable for him to listen to and softly said, "I'm going to the bathroom." After speaking, he disappeared as though his feet had been smeared with oil. The waiter by the side was slightly awkward. He politely asked, "Miss, what would you like to order?" In such situations, men would usually give in to women, so he was used to asking the woman directly. Jinwan glanced at the menu. She did not wish to continue occupying the waiter's time and casually ordered a few dishes. The waiter politely took the menu back and turned to leave. Jinwan lowered her head to look at her phone. If he didn't speak, she wouldn't take the initiative to speak. Anyway, she had never seen Mo Jingshan angry before. Even when she was still attached to him in the past, she didn't know how to coax him when he was so seriously angry, let alone now. She didn't plan to coax him at all. If he wanted to be angry, she didn't care. Although she had always maintained the attitude of a friend toward Mr. Vince and had never agreed or flirted with him in the past 3 years, she had always scrupulously abided by her own principles. But in the past 3 years, Mr. Vince had helped her a lot and taken care of her many times. It was all true. In the past 3 years, whenever she encountered difficulties, Mo Jingshan did not appear. He basically left her alone. Even if he was following the trajectory of her life, there were some things he had to let go and let her go on her own. But in the past 3 years, no matter how strong she was, she still received support and help from her friends. When he was not by her side, she was grateful to everyone who helped her, so it was impossible for her to maintain a cold attitude toward Mr. Vince. There was nothing wrong with being concerned about Mr. Vince's health. If Xia Tian wasn't feeling well, she would have been more concerned and even taken Xia Tian to the hospital. Between friends, why couldn't they be concerned? When Xiaohu came out of the restroom, he saw that the atmosphere at the table seemed to be in a cold war. He hesitated for a long time before returning. However, he tried his best to reduce his presence and did not dare to say that he was the one who arranged the seats for Jinwan and that BGY's general manager. He originally thought that he had kindly arranged a seat for Jinwan beside the business partner, but in the end, he caused such a scene. Seeing that Xiaohu had returned, Jinwan suddenly stood up. "I'm going to the restroom as well." Xiaohu coughed by the side. In such an atmosphere, escaping to the toilet was indeed the best method. He rushed to point toward the restroom. "The ladies' room is over there. I think it's on the 2nd floor. The 1st floor is for men." Jinwan nodded. She picked up her bag and phone and turned to leave. Less than a minute after Jinwan left, Mo Jingshan also stood up. Xiaohu's eyelids twitched. He did not dare to speak and only secretly glanced at COMO. He then saw that COMO also seemed to be heading in that direction. Earlier, when he reminded Jinwan, COMO should have heard it. However, when Xiaohu's gaze shifted in that direction, he saw his CEO boss casually passing by the men's restroom. His long legs took a step up the stairs to the 2nd floor. Chapter 582. Jinwan didn't go to the bathroom. She just wanted to stay away from the Cold War. She washed her hands and touched up her makeup. After about 10 minutes, she turned around and was about to go out, but when she walked out of the door, she suddenly saw the man leaning against the wall and smoking outside. As soon as she went out, she was surrounded by a cloud of smoke. She paused for a moment and watched the man smoking. Unlike other men, Mo Jingshan looked calmer and steadier when he smoked. Even though there was smoke around him, it didn't smell unacceptable. Instead, it smelled faintly of mint. But why did he come here to smoke? The men's bathroom was downstairs and this was the women's bathroom. She hadn't moved since she came out. She just stood on the spot and looked at him. The man also glanced at her when she walked out. The sparks between his fingers flickered. He didn't stop because she saw him, but he didn't do anything deliberately. The two of them just stood there silently and smoked silently. When Mo Jingshan put out the cigarette butt and threw it aside, Jinwan asked, "You don't seem to smoke much before." "Yes," the man said flatly. "Have you smoked often in the past 3 years?" "Occasionally." Jinwan didn't speak anymore. After all, when she was downstairs, the man's face was cold. Now she just came out to the bathroom, but he followed her. On the one hand, she felt she did nothing wrong, but on the other hand, she didn't know what to say or do. The man glanced at the bathroom behind her. "Is there anyone else in there?" "No." Jinwan was indeed alone in there just now. The man looked at her again, suddenly stood up from leaning against the wall, and then, before Jinwan could react, he took a step towards her. His approach was so oppressive that she instinctively took a few steps back into the bathroom. When the man also came in, her eyes froze. "This is the women's bathroom." Before she finished speaking, the door of the bathroom was closed by the man. "Jinwan?" The man was still approaching. She looked at him strangely and stepped back step by step until she leaned against the sink. "Mo Jingshan, are you trying to be a hooligan in the ladies' room?" Jinwan placed her hands behind her back, between her waist and the marble sink. Seeing that the man did not speak and only looked at her, it was as if he wanted to see through her and see what she was thinking through his almost compelling gaze. Jinwan turned her head away slightly, saying unhappily, "Weren't you still angry with me earlier? Are you still going to have a cold war with me? What is this now?" "Well, I'm not angry now." The man's tone was light, but he still didn't retreat. Jinwan immediately glanced at him. "Why aren't you angry? You were inexplicably angry and then inexplicably dispelled." "Some emotions come without reason, and it's true that I can't control them," the man said. "But if I continue to be angry, it doesn't seem to be good for me." Jinwan's expression was cold. "As expected, you're astonishingly calm in the face of everything. Even at a time like this, you can still consider the pros and cons. What can I do if I don't consider it? With your current temper, you don't even know how to coax people. I might not be able to pull you back. If I push you away again, I'm afraid you'll only jump further." The man's tone sounded light and indifferent, but he seemed a little aggrieved. Why was he aggrieved? Because she didn't coax him? How childish was this Mo Jingshan? But then again, her current words and actions were indeed very much according to her own temperament, and she was the kind that had no scruples at all. Jinwan didn't speak but raised her hand to push his chest, then put her hand on his body and said coldly, "Speaking of the story in the bathroom, I still remember that time in the bar before the divorce because I was flirting with those men on the dance floor. You directly dragged me into the men's bathroom. I was so angry that I pressed you against the wall and grabbed your shirt collar. Do you remember what you said to me at that time?" The man's brows moved. He didn't say anything, but he clearly remembered the shameless things he had said and done back then. "You said, 'You think you can hold me down?'" Jinwan's voice was light, and then she raised her eyebrows and slightly hooked her fingers to the collar of his shirt. She then gave a cold smile. "Mo Jingshan, do you think you can hold me down now?" With that, she was about to push the man away deadpan. However, the man didn't push her away. Instead, he easily raised his hand to hold her wrist, put his other arm around her waist and buckled her into his arms. When Jinwan was surprised, he bent his head and chuckled. "Of course I can. Jinwan?" This was not the script. Then, the man pressed her against the marble sink and held the back of her head with the hand that was around her waist. He leaned down and kissed her fiercely. This kiss seemed to be mixed with the anger that hadn't dissipated, showing that he was not as calm as he seemed. This kiss was impatient and aggressive. Jinwan leaned against the sink and suddenly wanted to resist. She raised her leg and was about to kick the man's leg, but the man pressed her leg under the sink with his strong, straight long leg and she couldn't move at all. "You? Mo Jingshan, you? Shin." Jinwan wriggled in his arms angrily. Mo Jingshan held her waist and deepened the kiss. From the initial aggression, it gradually softened and became a lingering kiss. While she was catching her breath, he pressed his lips against hers and said hoarsely, "A kiss can at least ease my anger. You don't want me to keep this anger until tonight, do you?" Tonight? She had been too busy these days. It was rare that Mo Jingshan didn't enter her room after she returned to the hotel and told her to have a good rest. Did he have any plans now? Jinwan rolled her eyes and bit the man's lips harshly. The man felt pain on his lips, but he didn't let go of her. It wasn't until both of them tasted blood that he withdrew from her mouth and looked down at her with a faint smile. "You bit me so hard. It seems you're looking forward to tonight, N?" There was a bit of blood on the man's lips, and there was a small wound that she had bitten at such a close distance. However, the visual effect was so damn sexy. Jinwan raised her hand to cover her red and swollen mouth, forbidding him to continue kissing her lips. Chapter 583. She subconsciously wanted him to find a door to hide in, but the man in front of her seemed not to hear the knock on the door. He still held her in his arms and did not move further. He just kissed her on the cheek again. Then he let go of her, turned around and went to open the door. Outside the door, there were two young girls who were in a hurry to enter the restroom. When they saw the man coming out, they were startled. However, the man was too handsome, and the two girls immediately swallowed their screams. They looked at the back of the man in disbelief. Even though he had just walked out of the women's restroom, he was still calm as if he had just casually strolled in a supermarket. Oh my God, he's so handsome. Shouldn't we be questioning why he went into the washroom? What if he's a pervert? Should we call the police? Call the police? How could such a handsome man be a pervert? Maybe he's just a toilet repairman? Have you ever seen a toilet repairman wear such an expensive shirt? Jinwan, who had just been pressed against the sink and kissed by the toilet repairman in the bathroom. Jinwan didn't return to the hotel in the afternoon. She had an itinerary that had been booked in the afternoon. She had been in Beijing for several days. Although MN Group didn't have many domestic partners in Beijing, there were many big shots in Beijing these days, and inevitably some of them would come here, so she had made a few last-minute appointments to meet them for business talks and social engagements. After lunch, Xiaohu sent Jinwan to the workplace. Jinwan asked Xiaohu to go back first and call him to pick her up after finishing work in the evening. But when she finished work, it was still not dark, and Jinwan had no intention of contacting Xiaohu. Fortunately, she had been careful these days and brought all her documents and things with her. It was very convenient to change hotels. The only inconvenience was that her luggage was still in the room of Xingtang Hotel, but it didn't matter. She could just call a nearby shopping mall to send her a few sets of clothes. So, the man who forced Jinwan to the sink in the restaurant's bathroom at noon and repeatedly said the word evening, with deep meaning, didn't see her return until it was dark. After 7 o'clock in the evening, it was dark and the lights were on in Beijing. Mo Jingshan took the documents that Xiaohu handed to him as he walked and was about to return to his room when he suddenly paused and turned to look at the closed door of the unoccupied room opposite him. His dark eyes slowly narrowed. He had a hunch. This woman probably wouldn't come back tonight. Less than half an hour later, Mo Jingshan's hunch came true. Xiaohu had just received a call, saying that Jinwan had booked a room in a 6-star hotel 5 miles away from Xingtang Hotel, and it was a suite with perfect security facilities and other aspects. The door could be double-locked from the inside. Even if someone had the room card from the outside, they couldn't get in. After hearing Xiaohu's trembling report, Mo Jingshan's expression did not change at all. He only calmly placed the document in his hand on the table by the side, his tone unhurried. Very good. After checking into a new hotel, a new room, and carrying 2 sets of new clothes that she had just ordered from the mall, Jinwan breathed in the relaxed and free air as soon as she entered the room. She threw herself onto the bed, feeling that even the smell of disinfectant on the hotel bed was so lovely. Nowadays, many hotels didn't allow too many locking functions inside because in recent years, many lawbreakers had done bad things in hotels, and there were often coma cases and murder cases. If there were too many locking functions inside, once something happened, the hotel staff wouldn't be able to detect too much, and they wouldn't be able to rescue them in time, so most hotels just locked the door or opened the door with a room card. In some particularly high-end hotels, a room card could solve all the locks inside and outside, such as Xingtang Hotel. It was useless for her to lock the door from the inside. If it weren't for the important work that had been added to her schedule these days, she would probably have flown back to High City. This hotel was found by her people nearby. It was not very far from Xingtang Hotel, only 5 miles away. If she really had to go to work with Mo Jingshan, it wouldn't take too long. It was rare to find such a good environment, advanced, well-equipped 6-star hotel that could be locked from the inside. As soon as she entered the door, she felt very relaxed. In the past few days, most of her schedule was with Mo Jingshan, so she had to stay in Xingtang Hotel. But from today on, she had basically figured out the schedule for the next few days. She still had to work alone most of the time, so there was no reason to continue to be tied to him. And the window of this hotel room was facing a famous lake in Jing City, and there was a medium-sized balcony outside the window. Jinwan stood up, pushed open the window and walked to the balcony. The sky had already darkened, and the headlights of the cars on the main street below the hotel were dazzling. The wind in Jing City was stronger and drier than in High City, causing the hem of her clothes to flutter. Jinwan stood on the balcony and looked up at the night sky immersed in dark clouds. She felt that it would be mostly rainy in Jing City these days. Her cell phone on the bed rang. Seeing it was raining, Jinwan turned back to the window, closed it and walked back to the bed. The message was naturally from Mo Jingshan. And this man sent her a WeChat message for the first time in her 2 lives. This was probably the first time in her 2 lives that Boss Missouri had used WeChat. However, the WeChat message he sent was just a short 2-second voice message. Jinwan clicked on it and heard the man's low voice. Escaped? Jinwan was expressionless after hearing this. She glanced at the 2-second voice message in her hand, put the cell phone aside, picked up the new clothes she had bought, and went into the bathroom to take a shower. In the Xingtang Hotel 5 miles away, the man sat in front of an empty room with only a 30-inch suitcase leaning against the wall, looking at his cell phone that had been quiet for a long time. Mo Jingshan narrowed his eyes and looked down at the chat interface on the cell phone. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 10 minutes, half an hour, she didn't reply? After leaving his sight, she began to return to her original appearance? Just as Mo Jingshan was about to put the cell phone down with a dark face, the cell phone suddenly vibrated in his hand, and there came the sound of a WeChat message. Chapter 584. Qin sighting. I've tolerated your profile picture for days. Why haven't you changed it yet? Mo Jingshan glanced at Qin sighting's disdainful tone and didn't reply. Then Qin sighting sent another message. I really don't mean to criticize you, but aren't you being too obvious by using Jinwan's photo as your profile picture? Mo Jingshan replied expressionlessly. Do you have a problem with that? Qin sighting. Of course I don't have a problem with that. But I wonder if Jinwan will have a problem with that. Will she tolerate your increasingly shameless side? Mo Jingshan stared coldly at Qin sighting's sarcastic words. He suddenly remembered that a few years ago, Qin sighting had said on the phone that if there came a day when he, Mo Jingshan, wanted to find Jinwan but couldn't find her, he would stab him in the heart with a knife and let him have a taste of the pain of being stabbed by his brother when he couldn't say anything. Mo Jingshan still didn't reply. However, a few minutes later, Qin sighting sent a screenshot of a WeChat chat. The screenshot was the chat between Qin sighting and Jinwan 2 minutes ago. Qin sighting, today you asked about gastroenteritis. Whose stomach is uncomfortable? Jinwan replied instantly, a friend. Qin sighting, so fast? Shouldn't you be resting at this time? Jinwan, I just took a shower and am lying in bed looking at my cell phone. I'll sleep in a minute. Qin sighting, didn't you go to Beijing on a business trip? Not with Mo Jingshan? Jinwan, no. Qin sighting, laughing, very good. Mo Jingshan looked at the few messages that Jinwan replied almost instantly on the screenshot, and his face gradually became indescribably gloomy. Assassin Qin, you've taken her to Jing City but you haven't settled it yet. I think Jinwan has long given up on love and doesn't love you at all. You'd better let go of her and let her find another man to marry. Anyway, you're the one who let go of her first. Smile, cute smile, laughing. Seeing that Mo Jingshan didn't reply, Qin sighting had a hunch in his heart. He casually sent an emoji and sure enough he replied with an exclamation mark, saying that he was not Mo Jingshan's friend and needed to be verified as a friend. Mo Jingshan, who was as calm as a god in times of trouble, also became angry out of shame. Seemed like he was right. Thinking of Mo Jingshan's current situation, and then thinking of the scene when he saw Jinwan standing like a ghost in the hospital corridor in Los Angeles. Although it was his own brother who was suffering from retribution, it was still an inexplicable pleasure. Jinwan had a very good sleep and felt very secure. When she woke up and opened her eyes, it was already past 8 o'clock in the morning. She had an appointment at around 10 o'clock in the morning which was nearby, so she was not in a hurry. She picked up her phone and glanced at it. It had been a quiet night. She then put down her phone, took a shower, changed her clothes, combed her hair and put on makeup. After he was done with everything he was about to go out when Xiaohu called. COG, it's almost time for the schedule you arranged this morning. Shall I drive you there? Xiaohu's tone was a little tentative. After all, Jinwan had stayed in another hotel last night. Right now he did not know how Jinwan was doing. There's no need. I'm very close to the place. If I take the subway it's only a few stops away. I'll take the subway. Xiaohu, okay then tonight. Xiaohu originally wanted to ask Jinwan if she wanted to go back to Xingtang Hotel tonight. After all, on the night she moved to another hotel, Mo stayed in her room all night and had not come out yet. However, before Xiao Hu said this, he suddenly saw the door of the room next to him open. Mo Jingshan was still dressed in the same clothes as last night, but there were no wrinkles on his clothes. It seemed that he had not slept all night. After coming out, he did not speak but looked at him indifferently. Xiao Hu immediately choked back his words, briefly told Jin Wan about her schedule in the next few days, and was about to hang up the phone. However, just before he hung up the phone, he suddenly heard Jin Wan say, "If it's convenient, please find time to send my suitcase here tonight. After all, my computer and some other things are in the suitcase." Xiao Hu didn't know whether he should agree or not, so he vaguely agreed and hung up the phone. Then he looked up at his boss's calm eyes. COG just said that she would take the subway to the workplace today. Mo Jingshan didn't speak. Although he had not slept all night, his face was not tired, his eyes were cold and clear, and he said nothing. Xiao Hu felt that the atmosphere was a bit oppressive, so he immediately smiled to ease his embarrassment, saying, "The traffic jam in Beijing is quite serious. If you don't drive, it's indeed more convenient to take the subway." He looked at the man whose expression did not change at all, thought for a while and said, "In addition, COG asked me to send her suitcase tonight. Mo, should I send it to her?" "Yes," Mo Jingshan said indifferently. Before Xiao Hu could see his boss's face, he had turned back to the room. That night, when Jin Wan returned to the hotel, she saw that her big suitcase had been sent by Xiao Hu and was placed in the front desk on the first floor of the hotel. When the staff saw her, they took the initiative to push the suitcase to her. However, not only the suitcase, but also Mo Jingshan, who had been waiting in the hotel's VIP lounge, was also sent here. Knowing that Mo Jingshan was here, Jin Wan didn't say anything and went to the VIP lounge under the guidance of the staff. When she walked over, the door in front of her was just opened by the staff and Jin Wan walked in. Their eyes met, and Mo Jingshan's dark eyes fell on the woman's face. Watching Jin Wan push her suitcase and walk in so casually, he didn't look away for a long time. Jin Wan glanced at him indifferently. She was not surprised that he would appear here, but she just glanced at him as if nothing had happened and didn't linger. The staff very sensibly walked out, leaving them some space, but the spacious room also fell into silence for no reason. Jin Wan gently held the handle of the suitcase and casually glanced at the environment of the lounge. Mo Jingshan's eyes fell on her face without any emotion, but he didn't look away. She suddenly turned back and was caught off guard by the man's deep eyes. They looked at each other for a few seconds. She smiled. Mo Jingshan indifferently raised his eyelids. After this woman escaped from his encirclement, her tone began to carry the sound of alienation. These days, whenever she was forced to call out Mo Jingshan's full name in anger, the delicate and lovely tone she showed was drowned out by the sense of distance emanating from her bones. The feeling of being stabbed in the heart last night had faded, but Jin Wan clearly had no intention of explaining why she ran away from him and ignored his message. She even seemed to take it for granted. Her cat claws, which she had hidden, were indeed very sharp once they were revealed. Chapter 585. Mo Jingshan didn't speak, so Jin Wan didn't speak. But she couldn't keep wasting time like this. Jin Wan had just come back from outside. Today she squeezed all her work into one day, trying to finish all the social engagements in 2 or 3 days, and then return to High City as soon as possible. At this moment she was a little tired and didn't have the energy to deal with too many things. She said lightly, "For the next few days I will complete my work in Jing City as scheduled. I will not miss a single thing. As for the few itineraries that I have to travel with you, I have already told Xiao Hu. If the timing is right, I will go. If not, then we will go our separate ways." She looked at the man who remained calm and said with a smile, "After all, Xingtang Hotel is a hotel invested by your company and many partners will also go there. It's really suitable for you to live there, but I'm different. I've hung out with you in the upper class of the Beijing circle for so many days and met all kinds of big shots. Now it's time for me to go back to my original work. It doesn't matter where I live. After the trip, I'll go back to High City." Jin Wan. She smiled. Mo Jingshan looked straight into her eyes, and his voice was indifferent and cold as if he wanted to see the deepest part of her heart. "You really don't love me anymore?" Jin Wan paused and then slowly smiled. However, the man on the sofa kept looking at her quietly, and she couldn't smile anymore but just smiled. If it could be said that she had truly loved him deeply when they went through life and death together in Cambodia, if it could be said that she had stubbornly insisted on staying by his side when he wanted to divorce her, even when he scolded her for being a bitch, then it could be said that she had truly loved him to the point where she had no regrets. But she also knew how she had felt when she signed the divorce papers and how she had survived the past 3 years. She remembered the day when she drank all night, stared blankly on the balcony of the hotel all night, and woke up and cut her long hair short. She might be touched or displeased by the fact that Mo Jingshan had an affair with another woman, or perhaps she was just unhappy that someone had taken a fancy to what she once had. This was human nature, but she wasn't sure whether it was love or not. Since even Mo Jingshan could clearly say that she didn't love him anymore, perhaps her attitude was too arbitrary and she had lost the hope of deliberately trying to make up for it. She didn't deliberately avoid him or approach him. Perhaps it was because she didn't spend any more time on him that he said she didn't love him anymore. Then maybe she really didn't love him anymore. Maybe, Jinwan replied after a long time. Why? Jinwan looked at him and suddenly fell into a trance. She then turned her face away and gently placed her hand on the handle of the suitcase, saying softly, "About 3 years ago, the child that had survived in my belly for more than 2 months and gradually began to have a fetal heartbeat was aborted. Perhaps the man I loved the most finally woke up, and my broken heart was frozen overnight. Even though you broke the ice on the surface with a reasonable and even considerate reason, the flesh and blood inside were still numb and cold." Seeing the man's dark eyes, she knew that he was also thinking about the baby, which was a sensitive point for Jinwan, and also for Mo Jingshan, so he often avoided this topic and never mentioned it. There were cars passing by outside the hotel, and not far from the lounge came the low voices of passers-by. Everything behind Jinwan seemed to become an illusory background. Mo Jingshan seemed to see through her indifferent face the woman he saw sitting outside 3 years ago when he woke up, and through the crack in the door of the ward, he saw the pale woman who had been waiting for him all this time. In these 3 years, it was as if she had silently endured everything that she could and could not bear. These 3 years had exploded in her body. She was strong because of the pain, but it was also because of her strength that she had sealed off many things that should have been soft in her heart. She learned to choose gains and losses, learned to bow her head under the eaves, and learned to find opportunities to break out of the cage. She seemed to be compromising, but in fact, the high wall in her heart was not destroyed at all. Jinwan said calmly, "Or maybe it's because I've lived 2 lives, loved madly, tried my best, and finally learned the whole truth. I'm just relieved, but I've already let go of many things that I should cling to. Mo Jingshan, in the past 3 years I've learned one thing, that is, love won't kill people. It will only destroy my original faith, but it will also help me build a new one. It makes Jinwan fall asleep, so now I'm not Jinwan. So, since even you can ask this question, maybe it means that you don't love me anymore." Jinwan finally came to a shallow conclusion. Seeing Jinwan's indifferent look when she said that she didn't love him anymore, Mo Jingshan remembered the dozens of messages she sent him 3 years ago, one of which was, "Mo Jingshan, I love you." But under his forced calm and indifference, he read those messages one by one and deleted them one by one. Mo Jingshan didn't force Jinwan to go back to Xingtang Hotel. In fact, even if Jinwan went back, she wouldn't have much time to rest. At most, she would sleep at night. She had nothing to do now. She squeezed all her work into a few days, and it didn't matter where she lived. She decided to stay in the hotel, which meant that she had officially entered the busy work of the business trip. And after Jinwan poured out all her heart to him, she returned to the gentle, cold, and untouchable person she was when she first returned to the country. Sometimes, Mo Jingshan's car was parked in front of the hotel where Jinwan was staying. Jinwan saw it when she came out, but she didn't go to their car. Instead, she went straight to the subway station or got into the car of some business partners waiting outside. It was autumn in Beijing and the weather had turned cold these days. After Jinwan finished her work at noon, she could have taken a break in the afternoon, but she suddenly received a call. It was Secretary Yang, who worked for Mr. Vince. She said that Mr. Vince suddenly had acute gastritis. Yesterday, when he was sent to the hospital, he learned that he had been having a fever for several days, and when he was sent to the hospital, he was unconscious. Chapter 586. When she arrived at the hospital, she learned that he had been sent to the hospital with acute gastritis yesterday and had been transferred to a general ward for an anti-inflammatory injection today. Jinwan called Secretary Yang again. After confirming the situation, she bought some liquid nutrition products for gastritis near the hospital and brought them in. Because they had come to Beijing on a temporary business trip, there were no family members or people from the company here. Yesterday, some business partners must have come to visit, so today the ward was particularly quiet. Seeing Jinwan come, Secretary Yang went out. Jinwan walked over and saw Mr. Vince leaning against the bed with a pale face. He was still receiving in-4 and there were several needle marks on the back of his hand. It could be seen that he had received a lot of anti-inflammatory injections. What did I tell you the other day? I told you to go to the hospital as soon as possible, but you didn't listen and suddenly became so serious. Did you go out to socialize and drink when your stomach was uncomfortable these days? Jinwan put down the nutrition products in her hand. Seeing her come, Mr. Vince was in a good mood although his face was not healthy. He said with a smile, I thought I could hold on. It's just gastritis, but I didn't expect to be knocked down by a few glasses of wine. Jinwan looked at him speechlessly and took the thermometer from his bedside. It's all right. It seems that you don't have a fever anymore. Secretary Yang said that she didn't know you had a high fever until yesterday. Your secretary is not very reliable. That day in the exhibition hall, I knew you had a fever. Why didn't she find out? She didn't stay in the same hotel as me. I asked her to go to several districts around Beijing for inspection and didn't ask her to follow me all the time, Mr. Vince explained. No wonder. Jinwan sighed. The doctor said it's all right, right? Just gastritis? Mr. Vince nodded with a faint smile. What else could it be? If it were any other serious illness, do you think Secretary Yang would have the time to leave the ward to the two of us? Jinwan, at this time he still didn't forget to flirt with a girl. She opened the things that she had bought. I bought some powders or paste that are suitable for brewing. In your current condition, you should only be able to eat liquid food for a few days. Take care of your stomach and don't drink for a while. People like us are always envied by others. It looks like we're especially rich, have a smooth life and don't have to worry about anything. However, most of our investments and business deals were negotiated over drinks. Do you think that BGY's general manager is a freeloader? Talking about business while drinking is also a skill. It's much more useful than your drinking capacity of a few glasses. Jinwan chuckled. That's right. Being a poor drinker has its advantages. At least it won't irritate your stomach like this. I think you're risking your life to do business. It's not as serious as you make it out to be. Have you ever been drunk before? Mr. Vince asked with a smile even though he knew the answer. Jinwan paused, but her hands didn't stop unpacking the supplements. She just said lightly, I was drunk but I haven't been drunk for a long time. All these years in London she had actually been slightly drunk. Although she said she was drunk, she wasn't completely drunk. At the very least she had always been sober. All these years she had to maintain her sobriety at all times to prevent her heart from falling. Their conversation shifted from wine to other topics. Jinwan was used to talking about work in front of Mr. Vince. In the past it was like this in London and it was the same after returning to China. In the past, to prevent him from talking about their relationship and causing awkwardness, she would always find topics to talk about. Now she didn't need to deliberately find topics to talk about, but this habit of talking had been formed. But this was also good. At the very least it wouldn't be awkward. What exactly is going on between you and COMO? After chatting for 2 hours in the ward, Jinwan originally planned to let Mr. Vince close his eyes and sleep for a while, but after a moment of silence his voice suddenly rang again. This time it was no longer just about work. Jinwan's hand that was casually flipping through the phone paused slightly. She looked up at him and happened to meet Mr. Vince's eyes. Her eyes fell back on the phone and her fingers slid open WeChat. She replied to Xia Tian who had just sent her a message. Then she accidentally saw the WeChat message below that she hadn't replied to. The man's name was still blank and so was his WeChat moments, but his profile picture was still hers. He hadn't changed it or he didn't intend to change it at all. She gently pressed the screen of the phone with her finger and smiled. What else could it be? We were just married before. Later, when we were in the same business circle, we inevitably met and had some minor friction. It seems that he doesn't intend to let you go. How did you two get divorced? Are you sure you've already divorced? Jinwan didn't understand why he asked this. She immediately felt a little amused. I signed the divorce agreement. After that, I went to the UK. As for the divorce procedures, I think even if I didn't go to the Civil Affairs Bureau in person, he would have the ability to handle the divorce. Why do you ask me this? Mr. Vince's expression faltered. You didn't go to the Civil Affairs Bureau? Jinwan also paused, feeling that he seemed to be implying something. What? Mr. Vince's eyes darkened, but he sighed helplessly with a smile. Jinwan, this is a society ruled by law. Since your marriage with Mo Jingshan was carried out in China, not registered abroad, a divorce is not as simple as a piece of paper. No matter how capable he is, To complete the divorce in China, in addition to your signature, he has to go to the Civil Affairs Bureau in person. Even if Mo Jingshan is the king of heaven, he can't do it for you in person. The corner of Jin Wan's mouth twitched and a corner of her heart sank. What do you mean? Although this is not a very optimistic situation for me, I still suggest you re-examine your relationship with Mo Jingshan. Are you sure you're divorced? Jin Wan, how could he not be divorced? For the sake of her life, Mo Jingshan had made such a huge change. He had forced her to leave and forced her to live in England alone. She had to face the unknown for the next 3 years alone. He had even taken the cruelest step. How could he not divorce her? Besides, he had sent the divorce agreement to her first, and she had sent it back to him after signing it. Although the man's column was blank when she signed it, he should have signed it immediately after receiving it. Signing, divorce, every step was the same as in her previous life. Chapter 587. Unless in her previous life they hadn't divorced completely. Seeing Jin Wan's bewitched look, Mr. Vince frowned. Have you ever seen what a divorce certificate looks like? Jin Wan put her hand on her lap and didn't speak. She just looked up at him. Aren't there many kinds of divorces in China? With the power of the Mo family and Mo Jingshan's ability, as long as I sign my name I can get it done, can't I? Mr. Vince gave a rare sneer. Naive. Jin Wan didn't speak. In the afternoon she sat with Mr. Vince in the hospital for a while and talked about other things. At sunset, when the doctor came into the ward to take him for a stomach examination, Jin Wan got up and left. On the way back to the hotel, she took out her mobile phone and looked up various questions on the internet about whether a person must be present in the divorce proceedings. The answers she found were all the same. Both parties must be present at the same time. This was a legal condition for divorce proceedings. The taxi stopped in front of the hotel. The driver looked back at her, only to see that she looked puzzled after looking at her cell phone. Then she closed her eyes and leaned against the seat as if she was about to fall asleep. The driver stopped the car and woke her up. Miss, we've arrived. Are you not feeling well? Do you need me to take you to the hospital? Jin Wan immediately opened her eyes, which were not sleepy at all. No. With that, she paid the taxi fare and got out of the car. Before returning to her room, she picked up her cell phone and wanted to call Mo Jingshan to ask him about it. However, when she thought of a certain possibility and recalled how heartless she had been to him that day, she felt it was unnecessary to call him now. Forget it. She'd better finish the business in Jing City as soon as possible and go back to High City as soon as possible. The next morning, when Jin Wan woke up and turned on her cell phone, she was suddenly bombarded by several messages. Xia Tian, what happened to you? Picture. Jin Wan zoomed in on the picture Xia Tian sent and saw that it was a gossip section of a financial newspaper. There was a color photo on it. The scene in the photo was Mr. Vince's ward in the hospital yesterday. Jin Wan was feeding Mr. Vince, and both of them had smiles on their faces. They seemed to be very close. From the angle of the photo, one could tell that it was taken by a medical staff or a passerby through the small square window on the door of the ward. They didn't expect that people in the business circle like them would be recognized by passers-by and even spread the photo as gossip. The business world wasn't as complicated as the entertainment world, but some famous bosses or top-notch professionals were often interviewed by the media. Gradually, people would recognize them. What's more, the real estate industry had gained a lot of attention in the country. Therefore, many people had seen the names and photos of some of the people in charge of large domestic real estate groups like BGY. The caption on the photo was, "The reason why Forbes #1 young female entrepreneur returned to China was because she fell in love with BGY Group's general manager." After seeing this report, Jin Wan didn't reply to Xia Tian's message. Instead, she made a phone call and asked someone to inform the media to quickly withdraw this messy news. MN Group might not be powerful enough to turn the clouds and rain over their hands, but she still had the ability to suppress this kind of gossip in the small financial news media. Furthermore, financial newspapers didn't have as much attention as entertainment newspapers. She had to withdraw the news and the photo before it was spread out. After dealing with the media, persuading, pressuring, and several other methods were used, the other party finally obediently withdrew the report that was originally going to be posted online. They also planned to publicly apologize for the false report and the act of fabricating a story based on the photos submitted by passers-by in the newspaper tomorrow. It was already afternoon. Jin Wan had several social engagements to attend today. She was going to have dinner with several partners in Beijing, so it was inevitable that she would drink some wine. She had booked a car in advance to pick her up at the club when it was time. After arriving at the entertainment club, Jinwan shook hands and chatted with the bosses of several business partners. Because they were all old friends who had worked with her for a long time, Jinwan didn't feel particularly restrained tonight. She didn't restrain herself when eating and drinking. Of course, she knew her alcohol tolerance, so she didn't drink too much. During this time, there were many people who asked her about the news with Mr. Vince today. Jinwan smiled and said she was just going to visit an old friend. However, she didn't expect that a passerby would take a photo of her outside the ward and spread it. She explained that she had been single all these years and that if she really had a boyfriend one day she would make it clear. Seeing that her words were very clear, and that there were not so many messy rumors in this circle, they laughed it off and continued to talk about business as usual. In the second half of the show, it was already 10 o'clock at night. It was raining heavily outside the club, so the bosses suggested waiting for the rain to stop. They arranged a large room in the club to play cards, sing, and drink a few cups of wine. Jinwan was slightly tipsy. She was in a good mood because she had just talked about a very good project, so she went to join in the fun. After 3 rounds of drinking in the private room, the bosses were playing cards. Jinwan drank a little too much tonight. Holding a can of beer that had just been opened, she walked to a corner of the luxury private room on the top floor of the club and looked at the semi-curved French windows. It was raining heavily outside. She held the beer in one hand and pressed the other against the window. Through the thick glass, she looked down at the lights of Beijing. But she was not in the mood to appreciate the rain in the waning lights. Her mind kept echoing with Mr. Vince's words about whether she was really divorced. The more she thought about it, the more she drank and the more sober she became. It was almost 12 o'clock at night, but the rain did not stop and was even getting heavier. The car Jinwan had booked had been parked outside for a long time. The driver called her several times but she did not answer. The private room was too noisy and Jinwan did not hear it at all. Because she drank too much, she forgot that the driver would come to pick her up. When Jinwan finally remembered it, it was already 12:30 at night. She picked up her cell phone and called the driver, staggering out as she spoke. She had just arrived at the elevator door and was about to step in when she saw Mo Jingshan suddenly appear in the elevator. She paused in her footsteps. Chapter 588. The moment she met the man's gaze in the elevator, Jinwan's legs froze. Was she hallucinating because she drank too much? Why did Mo Jingshan come here at this time? However, before she could say anything, the man walked out expressionlessly and glanced at the room behind her, which reeked of alcohol and was still filled with people singing in karaoke. Jinwan tried to straighten herself up, but the man only approached her. She subconsciously tried to move aside, but the moment she moved, she swayed. Just as she was about to fall, her waist was suddenly tightened. Mo Jingshan easily held her waist and then lowered his eyes to coldly glance at her. First, you went to the ward to flirt with that person from BGY, and then you came out in the middle of the night to socialize and drink with these people. You even got yourself drunk. Is this how you use the reason you don't love me to declare war on me? Jinwan's mind was in a mess. She couldn't understand what he was saying at all. She instinctively raised her hand to push him away, but the moment her hand touched the man's shoulder, her whole body fell uncontrollably into his arms. The moment her head bumped against his chest, she frowned and struggled to move back, but the man held her in his arms and showed no signs of letting her go. Mo Jingshan, let go of me. I'm not drunk. Jinwan heard the elevator door open and close. She staggered as she was held by the man into the elevator. Finally she was brought in. She raised her hand and pushed and hammered him twice, but she couldn't push him away, so she gave up struggling and just leaned in his arms, motionless. However, the more she breathed in the familiar scent of the man, the more drunk she seemed to be. She tried to shake her head to clear her head, but before she could move her head, the hand that was on her shoulder pressed her down heavily, and her entire body was pressed into his embrace. You? Jinwan's face was pressed against his chest. For a moment she could barely breathe. She forced her head away but her mouth was moaning. I'm really not drunk. I can still recognize you as Mo Jingshan. Really? The man didn't speak again until she was taken out of the club. There was a car parked in front of the door. Jinwan looked outside and suddenly smiled, mumbling, it's raining so heavily, good? Before she finished speaking, the man pressed her head into the car. Jinwan was pressed into the car. She was so drunk that it was impossible for her to sit in the passenger seat. Now she was almost lying on the back seat. She tried to get up, but after a long time she could only lie there weakly. Then she frowned and held her stomach. This posture made the liquor in her stomach shake back and forth, and she felt a little nauseous. "Do you want to throw up?" Seeing her holding her stomach, the man asked before closing the car door. Jinwan didn't respond and still lay on the back seat. She wanted to move, but she didn't have the strength. As soon as she moved, she felt dizzy and her stomach churned. Seeing that she didn't speak, Mo Jingshan closed the car door. The car drove fast. The driver and the car that Jinwan had arranged to pick her up were left outside the club. She couldn't remember anything at all. The hotel she was staying in was not very far from the club, but it was still 5 miles away from Xingtang Hotel. The car stopped at the door of her hotel. In the heavy rain, the car was washed by the rain and glowed coldly. The moment the door opened, Jinwan suddenly sat up with strength. When the man was about to take her out, she pushed him away hard, jumped out of the car, rushed into the rain and vomited on the ground. She had endured until now and didn't vomit on the car, which was the last reason she had in her drunken appearance. Ugh! After vomiting for a long time, she only vomited a lot of alcohol. She didn't eat much in the evening, but she drank a lot, especially a lot of beer. Jinwan's alcohol tolerance was only limited to foreign wine or champagne, but she still couldn't handle domestic white wine and beer. Fortunately, the rain was so heavy that the alcohol she vomited was instantly washed into the roadside sewer and disappeared in the blink of an eye. After vomiting out a lot of alcohol in her stomach, Jinwan's legs softened and she almost knelt on the ground. At the moment when her knees almost touched the ground, her abdomen suddenly tightened, and the man took her into his arms in time. He looked down at her, who was standing in the rain but still hadn't woken up and still had a dazed expression. The man's expression was cold as he lifted her up in his arms and helped her stand firmly. "Do you still want to throw up?" he asked. His tone was obviously angry, but he didn't take it too seriously because she was not sober enough. Jinwan looked at the man in front of her in a daze, shook her head, and then suddenly looked like she was going to vomit again. She tried to push him away again, but this time she didn't push him away. He took her to the side and helped her bend over to vomit, lest she lost her balance and fell to the ground. This time she didn't vomit much. She probably drank too much and stayed in the car for so long. She felt so uncomfortable because of carsick and the after effects of being drunk. After vomiting for a while, Jinwan was completely exhausted and didn't even have the strength to struggle in Mo Jingshan's arms. She leaned weakly in the man's arms with her legs weak. Seeing that she was almost done vomiting, Mo Jingshan carried her in his arms and strode into the hotel. The hotel staff saw Jinwan, who was soaked in the rain, being carried in by a man who was also soaked in the rain. The staff had an impression of Jinwan and knew that she lived here, but the man carrying her, originally they wanted to step forward to ask her help, but when the man carried her into the elevator, he cast a cold glance at them, causing them to stop in their tracks. They didn't dare to take a step closer. Jinwan's room card had her floor and room number written on it. When she was carried in, she frowned and subconsciously raised her hand to scratch the door, mumbling, "No. Mo Jingshan, this is where I live, get out." The man didn't seem to hear what she was muttering and directly brought her in. Chapter 589. Jinwan was placed on the sofa. Her wet hair stuck to her neck and cheeks. Her eyes, red from the alcohol, were slightly open. She stared blankly at the man in front of her, who did not lose any of his temperament even after being drenched in the rain. Since she said those words to him that day, she had not thought of facing him again. Right now her head was dizzy and her body was heavy. She simply sat on the sofa and did not move. Although Jinwan had drunk too much, her habits in recent years had allowed her to maintain a little bit of rationality. Even if she was really drunk, she would not talk nonsense. Even if she really wanted this man to get out of her room, she raised her hand slightly, put it down, and did not speak in the end. After getting drunk and vomiting, the only thing left to do now was probably sleep. However, the man's voice rang when her thoughts were about to return to chaos. "You were just drenched in the rain. Do you want to go in and take a shower, or do you want me to take off your clothes here?" Jinwan's mind paused. She opened her eyes and looked at the man in front of her in a daze. "You, don't talk nonsense. Go in and take a shower." Jinwan looked at him and then at the bathroom not far behind him and did not move. It was not until the man bent down to carry her from the sofa into the bathroom that she hurriedly dodged his hand as if she had been electrocuted. She staggered to her feet and walked to the bathroom, but still could not stand steadily because of the alcohol. She supported her hand on the wall for a while before she walked in and closed the door. She was not in the mood to take a bath, so she just turned on the shower head to wash herself. Then she remembered that she had just vomited, so she grabbed the spare disposable toothpaste and toothbrush in the hotel bathroom. After brushing for a long time, she did not know if there was any taste of alcohol on her body or in her mouth. She lowered her head and sniffed but could not smell anything. She stood under the shower head in a daze. Her eyes were still a little dazed and she could not stay completely sober. But she still remembered that Mo Jingxian was outside, so she took a little longer to shower. Half an hour later she put on a bathrobe, casually dried her hair and went out. When she went out, her hair was still dripping and the water droplets submerged in the bathrobe, making it a little cold. She showered after being drenched in the rain, but the man was not in a hurry to shower. His soaked suit jacket was thrown on the sofa in the room that could only accommodate 2 people. Due to the color of his black shirt and trousers, it was hard to see any changes after being drenched. Jinwan stood outside the bathroom door, but her footing was a little unstable. She turned around and leaned against the wall to support herself. She forced herself to stay sober as she said, "My work in Jing City is almost done. Tonight is my last social engagement. Perhaps thinking that I can return to High City tomorrow, I felt relieved and drank a little more, but I'm not too drunk." Hearing that she would return to High City tomorrow, the man did not move but his eyes fell on her. Because Jinwan had just showered and was drunk, her cheeks looked redder than usual and her eyes were dazed. She was not as firm and indifferent as she had been that day when she stood in front of him and said that she no longer loved him. She stood against the wall and said indifferently, "My ticket back to High City has been booked. The flight is tomorrow afternoon." The man just sat there coldly and quietly watching her. Jinwan raised her hand to touch her still wet hair. When she felt the water on her head, she frowned uncomfortably. She wanted to go back to the bathroom to get a towel to wipe her hair, but then she paused and thought of something. She said, "Did you see the news that I went to the hospital yesterday?" She paused and said, "In the past 3 years, if I had accepted any man's pursuit, I wouldn't have been able to stand here now, whether it was Mr. Vince or any other man. When I didn't know the reason for the divorce, after the divorce, I had the right to pursue happiness at any time. Even if I really have an ambiguous relationship with any man, or have feelings beyond friendship, it doesn't violate any morality, and it can't even be considered as having an affair." Besides, she had rejected Mr. Vince countless times and had never responded to him emotionally. This time, it was only because Mr. Vince was sick that she took the initiative to care about him. In her eyes, she only stood on the side of friendship. She was used to doing things her own way and didn't care what others thought. Perhaps because she hadn't vomited all the wine in her stomach, or perhaps because it was too hot when she took a shower in the bathroom, Jinwan could only stay awake for a moment. She couldn't remember what she was saying, but from the man's eyes, she could see that she seemed to be saying something particularly heartless. She still felt like vomiting, so she turned back to the bathroom and retched into the toilet, but nothing came out. The man didn't say anything because of what she said just now. He threw a towel to her head. "Wipe your hair clean. I'm going to buy some hangover medicine." Jinwan didn't speak. She just raised her hand and pressed the towel that almost covered her entire head over her head. It wasn't until she heard the door open and close that she pulled the towel down and wiped her face mechanically. After drying her hair, Jinwan walked out of the bathroom. She was a little thirsty and went to pour herself a glass of water. However, while her body was weak, she couldn't even hold the glass firmly. The glass of hot water that wasn't hot fell to the ground before it reached her mouth. Fortunately, the water wasn't hot. Jinwan stood by the table, watching the water spilled on the carpet and the glass that fell to the side. She stared blankly for a long while before she came back to herself. She raised her eyes and looked out the window at the heavy rain that was still falling. The floor she lived on was very high. What floor was it? It seemed to be the 30th floor of a hotel. From here, she could see half of Jing City brightly lit under the rainy night. Jinwan poured herself another glass of water and carefully picked up the glass to drink, but her hands were still so weak that she could barely hold it. She held the glass with both hands, but in the end, before the water reached her mouth, it spilled all over her. She gave up and kicked away the 2 cups that had fallen to the ground with an ugly expression. She raised her hand and touched the wet bathrobe. She felt a little hot in her head and listened to the sound of rain outside the window. She really wanted to feel the cool breeze to wake herself up. Chapter 590. So cold. So comfortable. In the past few years, because of her cold body, she had been very careful not to touch or drink anything cold. Even on the hottest days of summer, she did not dare to drink ice water. Suddenly standing on the ice-cold ground full of water stains, with the cool rain falling on his head, extinguishing the unreasonable heat on his body. It was really comfortable. Jinwan stood numbly on the balcony facing the rain and wind. She closed her eyes and allowed her freshly showered body to be baptized by the heavy rain again. She allowed her shoulder-length hair to fall on her shoulders and breathed in the damp and cold smell of the rain. In her handbag in the room her cell phone rang. Jinwan ignored it as though she did not hear it. She opened her eyes slightly to watch the heavy rain, a smile on her lips. The rain was so heavy that she did not hear the sound of Mo Jingshan opening the door when he came back. When she finally heard the sound, the man had already pushed open the half-closed floor-to-ceiling window behind her, making a loud noise. Jinwan was so frightened by this voice that her shoulders involuntarily shrank back. She turned around, her eyes blurred by the rain as she stared at the man whose expression was cold and ugly. "What are you doing?" The man's voice was even colder than the autumn rain. Jinwan, who originally felt very comfortable in the rain, could not help but shiver in her heart. She looked at him in a daze and her lips, which had been washed white by the rain, moved. Watching the rain, Jinwan's current appearance was indeed sober, but it was also true that she had drunk too much. Her hair was all wet and the wet bathrobe was cold and heavy on her body. The towel that she had used to dry her hair was placed on her shoulders to withstand the baptism of the autumn rain, and her face was full of rain. But this indescribable abjection made it seem as though she had shed the cold and arrogant mask of the past 3 years, shed the so-called shell of no love, and stood here in a daze. Jinwan tilted her head slightly, and from the corner of her eyes, she saw that the man was holding something he had just bought from the pharmacy. Who would have thought that the great Mo Jingshan would one day run an errand in the rain to buy medicine in the middle of the night? He was clearly also wet, but he always made it seem as though she was the one in a more sorry state. She could not help but smile again. However, she laughed until the man's face turned even uglier. Jinwan's wrist was suddenly tightened, and before she could make a sound she was dragged from the balcony into the window by the man. Then the floor-to-ceiling window was slammed shut, and the curtains were blown up by the wind from the force of the slamming of the window. In the end, the curtains fluttered back into the window. "You just took a shower and now you're out in the rain. Don't you feel how cold and bone-chilling the autumn rain is in Beijing? With the way you torment yourself, I think you won't be allowed to board the plane tomorrow afternoon because of your high fever." The man gripped her wrist tightly, causing Jinwan to stumble and almost fall into his arms. She managed to steady herself but still swayed because her legs were weak and her head was dizzy. The man's hand caught her waist at the right time, preventing her from falling down. Because of her swaying and the sudden strength of his hand on her waist, Jinwan felt her entire body tremble. The feeling of the world spinning came back again. She immediately narrowed her eyes and furrowed her brows, but did not explain anything. She pursed her lips and pushed him away. If it weren't for the fact that Jinwan's complexion was too pale, Mo Jingshan would definitely have said harsher words. However, seeing that the little woman was so drunk that she could not tell north from south and was forcing herself to act as though nothing was wrong, the man's expression was heavy as he brought her to the sofa. He tossed the hangover medicine in his hand aside and reached out to undo her rain-soaked bathrobe. However, Jinwan abruptly raised her hand to cover the collar of the bathrobe. She struggled for a moment. "I'll wash myself when I want to. Haven't you already bought the hangover medicine? I'll drink it myself. Go." The man's hand paused on her collar for a moment. Jinwan did not look at the man's eyes and turned away to leave. However, her feet staggered and the man's long arm reached out to pull her back. Jinwan was slightly flustered because of the dampness on her body and the heavy bathrobe. She angrily raised her hand and used all her strength to push and hit him. However, even if she used all her strength, she would not be able to do much to this man. She raised her half-conscious eyes to glare at the man's ink-like deep eyes. You'll shower yourself? You'll make your own hangover medicine? If you could do that 3 years ago, you wouldn't have soaked in the hotel bathtub for 2 days and 2 nights and almost lost your little life. With that lesson in mind, I won't leave until I see you obediently clean yourself up. If you have the strength, why don't you hurry up and take a hot shower?" Feeling the coldness on her body, the man furrowed his brows and directly untied the belt in the middle of her bathrobe. Jinwan frantically held onto the bathrobe that was about to fall open. When the man raised his hand to help her take it off, she struggled to lower her head to bite him. However, after a long while she was unable to bite him. She was so angry that her eyes turned red. She angrily scolded, "Mo Jingshan, you bastard. Don't take off my clothes. You don't remember what I said that day, do you?" The man's hands did not stop moving. As he touched her body, he felt that the originally cold temperature on her body was gradually turning hotter and hotter. He suspected that she had already developed a fever from the rain when she came back. However, Jinwan continued to hold onto his chest and refused to let go. Her mouth kept muttering indistinctly until she said hatefully, "I said I don't love you anymore. I don't love you anymore. Mo Jingshan. You're not allowed to take off my clothes. I don't love you. Get lost." Before she could say anything worse in the next second, the man abruptly pulled her to the front with great force. As she was about to continue scolding him with reddened eyes, he held the back of her head and kissed her. The cool, masculine scent that carried the dampness of the rainy night covered her lips. It was not a simple kiss like before. He directly pried open her lips and penetrated deep and heavy. Jinwan's brain that had been numbed by alcohol instantly stopped moving. She trembled in the man's embrace and bit him hard. She took the opportunity to struggle to say, "I don't, you." Even the root of her tongue felt as though it was about to be seized. Jinwan's entire body trembled. She raised her leg to kick him, but the bathrobe was too heavy. Her feet were only indoor shoes and did not have any offensive power. Instead, the man's strong fingers locked onto her waist. It was as though he was about to squeeze her into his body. Just as Jinwan was about to bite him, he harshly took her lips and brought her back. She was heavily thrown onto the sofa. Chapter 591. He pressed her under his body, trapping her firmly like an invisible lock. Jinwan fell onto the sofa. Because she was lying under him, her eyes revealed some panic. Mo Jingshan was above her, ignoring all her struggles and kicks. He looked at her with his deep ink-like eyes, and the flames of calmness were burning quietly. Under his gaze, Jinwan felt flustered. She quickly moved her eyes away, only to see the man's slender and well-defined fingers unbuttoning his shirt. His clothes had also been drenched by the rain, but they were still black. The collar gradually opened, and the man's Adam's apple rolled in front of her eyes. Jinwan's entire body tightened. "Say it again, you don't love me, N?" The man pressed her down with one hand and took off his clothes with the other. He didn't have the time to continue kissing her, but his voice and tone were so heavy that she could clearly feel that he was really provoked by her. Jinwan watched as the man's well-dressed shirt was unbuttoned. She wanted to move back, but her legs were pressed down by the man's knees. She pushed him hard but to no avail. Seeing the man's chest becoming clearer and clearer in front of her eyes, she felt a loud bang in her head. Her bathrobe, which was soaked in water, was already open because the strings were undone. The man could easily take off her bathrobe. When he pressed her down, Jinwan raised her hand to block him. "Mo Jingshan, what do you mean? What are you doing?" The next moment, the man held her wrist and pressed her against the sofa. Mo Jingshan lowered his head, and his breath sprayed on her cheek. "You." Jinwan didn't react at first. When she finally understood what he meant, her eyes immediately turned red. However, before she could speak, the man's kiss fell again. This time he didn't let her escape easily. Jinwan didn't know what he meant. She didn't know what he meant. Her hands and feet were restrained by the man at the same time. This kiss was not gentle at all, and because she kept trying to bite him, it was stained with the smell of blood. Mo Jingshan had always been too indulgent with her. When she refused, he didn't really force her. But at this moment, being pressed against the sofa by the man, Jinwan clearly felt that the man was using the most primitive physical force to suppress her. This kiss was full of invasion and plunder, and she couldn't stop trembling under him. "No." Jinwan was still struggling, but the heavy bathrobe on her body had been taken off. She wasn't wearing any clothes at all. The man blocked her lips. Her hands were held against the back of the sofa by him, and his knees were pressed against her so that she couldn't move at all. His deep, scorching, conquering kiss moved down from her lips, down her neck, down to her collarbone. She had never seen him like this before, and he didn't. He didn't look as he usually did. The more she struggled and resisted, the more he wanted to suppress her. The more she struggled, the more he lost control. Whether it was his lips, hands, or the strength of his hands, he couldn't control them at all. They gradually became heavier. And the burning temperature of Jinwan's body made the blood of the man who was supposed to be sober gradually boil. He didn't have the slightest intention of letting her go. Jinwan was naked because the bathrobe had been thrown off the sofa by the man, but the man was still wearing everything except for his unbuttoned shirt. Her hands were held by the man, and her eyes were red with anger. She gritted her teeth and called out his name, "Mo Jingshan." The man's kiss fell on her lips again, stopping her from cursing. At the same time, he slowly bit her lips that had been kissed red and swollen. Jinwan's whole body was limp and trembling, and even the hands between their bodies softened. Even her hair was messily spread on the sofa. It was a kind of embarrassing and helpless feeling. "Mo Jingshan, I drank tonight but I'm still sober. Don't take advantage of me." The man held her waist with one hand and supported himself by her side with the other. His dark and hot eyes stared at her unscrupulously. His thin lips moved slightly and his voice was low, husky, and firm. "It's not sober or not. You're the one who knocked yourself against my gun. I'm not taking advantage of you. Today I'm going to take you." Jinwan stared at him in disbelief. Her breath caught in her throat because of his words. She hurriedly pushed him with all her might, but the man easily restrained her hands with one hand and pressed her into the sofa with even more force. Jinwan panicked. "You," however, before she could finish her words, the man bent down to kiss her again from her lips to her cheeks, to the sensitive area by her ear, and finally sucked on her earlobe. Under this action, Jinwan's legs were still pressed down. She wanted to move, wanted to struggle, wanted to hit him with something but could not do as she wished. She even wanted to say that she did not love him, but every time she opened her mouth, the man would cover it. She could not even say a complete word. When Jinwan's hands were pulled down by him again, her expression faltered. Her whole body trembled uncontrollably under the man's deep, yearning gaze. "You can't make it through tonight. Even a cold shower is useless. Be good in?" The man's breath landed by her ear and his voice was too low and husky. His words were telling her that no matter what, he would not give her any room to retreat tonight. However, it was clear that Jinwan did not have any room to escape. She suddenly regretted drinking so much. Right now, her whole body was weak and she did not even have the chance to resist. After not doing it for more than 3 years, Jinwan's heart was slightly empty and lost. She remembered that 3 years ago, this man had pressed her against the door of that ward in Los Angeles, saying that he was going to stab her heart with knife after knife. She remembered that in her first year in London she had tasted the taste of failure and stayed up all night, working like a machine every day. She remembered that Auntie Chen had said that after she signed the divorce papers, he had smashed up the entire Yew Garden. She raised her hand to scratch the man's face harshly, but the moment she raised her hand he caught her wrist. The man's thin lips pressed against her ear, and his voice was heavy and husky as he said, "Right now, any movement of yours will agitate me to the point of losing my mind. If you don't want to be hurt by me, be good and don't move." Jinwan bit down harshly on her lips that had turned white. This man was actually threatening her. Chapter 592. The crisp sound of his belt unbuckling could be heard. Jinwan abruptly raised her upper body to escape, but the man pressed her back onto the sofa. Even at this moment she still refused to yield. However, under the man's control, under the control of a man who understood her too well, once she fell into his hands, there was no way for her to resist at all. Taking advantage of the moment he released her leg, Jinwan raised her leg to kick him. However, before she could kick him, her ankle was abruptly caught by him. After being separated for more than 3 years, this woman's body felt as though it was her first time. Jinwan's face paled from the pain. She abruptly turned around and harshly bit down on the man's arm. Mo Jingshan was not much better off. Earlier on she was already showing signs of having a fever. Her body was already burning hot. The man could not help but raise his hand to hold her chin. He lowered his head to kiss her lips. However, Jinwan continued to struggle violently. She did not cooperate at all. Her limbs were not under her control. She was completely under the control of the alcohol. She wanted to hit him, push him away, and did not want him to be satisfied. Why did he have the right to do whatever he wanted? Why did he think it was for her sake that he could hide everything and push her away so cruelly? In the end, he only casually said it was all for her. Why was he able to control everything so calmly? Usually, no matter how forceful Mo Jingshan was, at the very least, he had always considered her feelings and never forced her. Even before their divorce, he had never forced her. But now, what did this count as? He actually dared to force himself on her. This bastard. Scum. He had nothing to do with being a gentleman. He was a bastard. The battle was intense. In the past few years in England, Jinwan had been wearing some skincare products to prevent her skin from turning red and swollen due to her acclimatization. 3 years of taking care of her skin had made her skin even more tender, delicate, and white, and even more sensitive. If he used a little more force, it was easy to leave marks on her body. Looking at the uneven marks on her body, It was as though Mo Jingshan was bewitched and could not stop. He patiently kissed every inch of her body. The night fell. If Jin Wan was said to be a hedgehog whose thorns had been forcefully plucked, then Mo Jingshan was transformed from a dignified CEO boss into a bandit. She couldn't even remember if she had said a complete sentence last night. She only had a vague impression of a few sentences. She vaguely remembered that the man's breathing was clearly erratic, but his low and calm voice was close to her ear, asking again and again, "I'm asking you, do you still love me?" As long as he didn't get the answer he wanted, he would find another way to torment her. Until Jin Wan gave a satisfactory answer, almost sobbing. Dawn. Jin Wan couldn't get up at all. She couldn't even get up. The little woman's hair was a mess. Her face, which was pale from being bullied last night, was now extremely red. She hadn't woken up since dawn and had been in a deep sleep. The only thing he could touch was the scalding heat on her body and forehead. Last night, Jin Wan had been burning hot. It was so hot that Mo Jingshan had almost lost his rationality. He was immersed in the heat and ignored her hoarse cries. It was only when he held the thermometer he had requested from the hotel staff and saw that it showed 39.6 degrees that he finally regained his composure. Jin Wan was still sleeping. His fingers brushed aside the hair on her face, revealing her abnormally red face. Half of her face was buried in the pillow, and she looked miserable and helpless. After sleeping for an entire day, she finally showed signs of waking up. When she opened her eyes, even though she was still lying on the bed, she still felt as though the entire world was spinning. She furrowed her brows in discomfort and closed her eyes again, trying to ease the dizzying feeling. Chapter 593. Her body felt heavy and her entire body was aching. She could not muster up any strength, but her body felt refreshed, unlike last night when she was sweating profusely under the man's body and tossing the bed into a mess. She must have washed her body thoroughly. Even her hair was clean and fluffy, smelling like shampoo. When she opened her eyes, she found herself still in the hotel room. At the same time, she felt a faint discomfort and soreness in her lower body. She did not even need to think to know that everything that happened last night was real. Jin Wan opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling and overhead lights. She was still in a daze and did not understand how things had developed to this point. She turned to look at the sky outside the window. It was getting dark. It was clear that she had missed her flight back to High City. However, she was still in a daze. She raised her hand to touch her forehead, only to feel a rectangular patch. She peeled it off and looked at it. She then closed her eyes to ease the dizziness in her head. She cursed Mo Jingshan hundreds of times in her heart. He clearly knew that she had a fever last night, but he actually did it for an entire night. Based on the situation last night, if it weren't for the fact that she had paid attention to training her body and persisted in exercising over the past few years, which improved her constitution, she would have probably died from overindulgence last night. He even used this kind of patch. Furthermore, she felt weak even when she thought about it. It was easy to guess that her fever was not low. In addition, she had a hangover from last night. No wonder she felt so uncomfortable, as though she was suffering from vertigo. Jin Wan was still lying on the bed, fighting against her spinning head. However, after struggling for a long time, she still could not sit up. Even the slightest movement of her head made her feel as though the world was about to turn upside down. The hangover was really uncomfortable. She turned her head to look at the hangover medicine in the corner of the sofa. Mo Jingshan knew that she would feel uncomfortable when she woke up, so he bought this for her. However, in the end, not only did she not drink it, it even turned into, she put the heat relief back on her head, put her hand down and turned her head. Suddenly, the man's handsome face and tall figure appeared in her line of sight. She saw that Mo Jingshan was still in her room. Although he was wearing clothes, the clear scratches on the man's neck caused her eyes to stare. Those were the scratches she had left on his body last night when she cried until her voice was hoarse. Jin Wan immediately sat up, but her movement was too abrupt. Before she could glare at the man, she abruptly fell back. Although her head did not hurt when it hit the pillow, the dizziness made her moan uncomfortably. She raised her hand to her head and moaned in pain. The man was holding a glass in his hand. Seeing that she had fallen back onto the pillow, he walked over and said in a low voice, "Lie down and don't move. Take the antipyretic when you wake up." Jin Wan glanced at the glass of water and medicine that the man had placed on the bedside table. Before she could speak, the man had already reached out to help her up. He placed the soft pillow behind her back so that it would be easier for her to drink the medicine. Jin Wan did not have much strength. Seeing the man's attitude as though nothing had happened, her eyes almost turned red from anger. Even the events of last night rushed into her mind. Her heart was filled with anger. Without even half a second of hesitation, she sat up and pushed the man who was about to feed her water down the bed. How could she have the strength? Earlier she had not been able to sit properly. Mo Jingshan was not pushed off the bed, but the glass of water in his hand was almost knocked over by her. He steadied the glass and placed it by the bedside. At the same time he held her wrist with his other hand. When Jinwan almost fell headfirst onto the bed, he hugged her. You've had a fever for an entire day and night. Don't toss about. Obediently take your medicine. Jinwan raised her head to look at his lazy and calm appearance. She adjusted her beard several times before spitting out a complete sentence. Her voice was cold and stifled. So you know that I've had a fever for an entire day and night? Then why didn't you stop last night? I begged you so much but you wouldn't stop. Do you want me to die? The man still sat down by her bedside. Under her icy gaze, he caressed her burning face as though comforting her. There was a smile on his lips as he warmly said, "The more you beg me, the more I can't control myself. I'm sorry. In the future I'll be gentler." You're still thinking about the future? Jinwan immediately glared at him coldly. After a night of indulgence, Jinwan was completely naked. When she saw that Mo Jingshan was dressed neatly, her anger grew. However, no matter how she tossed and turned, the only word she could think of was to scold him. In the future? There would definitely be no future. She wanted to hit him, but the man had already placed the medicine in her mouth. As the bitterness spread in her mouth, he brought the glass of water to her lips. Jinwan had no choice but to quickly drink the water to swallow the medicine. However, her throat was dry and painful. After drinking so much water, she choked for a moment. The moment she coughed, the man placed his hand on her back and gently patted it. Yet even with such patience and gentleness, it could not erase his violent actions last night. Last night's battle was intense. The clothes he wore on the sofa could no longer be worn. This set of clothes must have been sent over. Seeing that he was dressed and no longer had the unstoppable manner he used to bully her, Jinwan coughed several times and turned her head to continue coughing. She did not even want to look at him. When the sun rose, I called the doctor over and gave you some medicine. You were drenched in the autumn rain right after taking a hot shower. The cold air invaded your body too quickly, causing your fever to persist. Take your medicine on time and rest well. Once your fever completely subsides, you'll be fine. The man's hand was still pressed against her back. When Jinwan coughed again, he patted her again. Jinwan wanted to push him away and get off the bed. However, the man's actions appeared patient and gentle, yet he kept her firmly on the bed. He had no intention of letting her get off the bed so easily. Are you sure you can get off the bed in your current state? The man's tone was calm, yet his words seemed to carry a double meaning. Her current state? This reminded her of something. Jinwan pushed him again but to no avail. In the end, she could only struggle with the quilt beside her. She pulled the quilt up and covered herself with it, covering her naked body and the red and purple marks on her body. Seeing that she still had the energy to argue with him even though her face was flushed red from the fever, Mo Jingshan chuckled softly. Lie down properly. I'll help you cover it. Jinwan tugged at a corner of the blanket, angrily saying, There's no need. Chapter 594. However, the man suddenly let go of her, and she immediately fell onto the bed as soon as she pulled the quilt back. The moment she lay back, she turned her head with a jerk, only to see the man's thin lips slightly curved as if laughing at her for overestimating herself. She was so angry that she rolled her eyes and covered her head with the blanket. I just took the medicine. Wait a minute. Someone will bring food over in a while. If you don't have the strength, I'll feed you. With your fever like this, you need to have the most basic strength to compete with me. You should know what's best for yourself. The man's voice came from outside the quilt. Jinwan didn't speak under the quilt, but she did have a serious fever. She didn't sweat even after being under the quilt for so long. If she did sweat, her fever would probably go down. After a while, when she felt the man sitting by the bed get up and leave, she slowly pulled the quilt back down. She stared at the darkened sky outside the window and confirmed that she had really slept the whole day. At this time, she really didn't have the strength or energy to think about anything. Since she had missed the flight back to High City, even if she wanted to go to the airport now, it was likely that she couldn't book a ticket for the same day. Besides, she really couldn't get up now. She had just been tortured last night. There was no need to make things difficult for herself now. She opened her eyes to look at the sky outside the window for a while, gradually closed her eyes and accidentally fell asleep. Half an hour later, Mo Jingshan received the dinner delivered by the hotel staff outside. When he brought it in, he saw that the little woman was still sleeping on the bed, curled up into a ball under the quilt as if she was particularly insecure. She was curled up into a ball again. She didn't wear anything and instinctively wrapped herself tightly in the quilt. Before dawn he carried her to take a shower. He originally wanted to help her put on clothes, but she was tired and confused. After putting him on the bed, she cried and struggled to stop him from touching her. In the end, she wrapped herself in the quilt and shrunk to the corner of the bed. Motionless, she closed her eyes and sobbed as she fell asleep. Seeing her pitiful appearance, he gave up and didn't insist on helping her put on clothes. Although he couldn't bear to wake her up now, she hadn't eaten anything all day. When she was unconscious during the day, he had tried his best to feed her the medicine. If she didn't eat anything now, the medicine would be enough to make her stomach feel uncomfortable, not to mention that she had consumed so much energy last night under the condition of a fever. Eat before you sleep. Mo Jingshan pulled her out of the quilt. Jinwan was in a daze when the man suddenly dug her out of bed. She instinctively frowned, and before she opened her eyes she heard the man ask her in a low husky voice, "Vegetarian dumplings, tofu soup, vegetable porridge and a few side dishes. What do you want to eat?" Jinwan opened her eyes to see the man's face so close to hers. Realizing that she was being held by him, she immediately scrunched up her feverishly flushed face. She turned her head away to look at the tray and the things on it on the table not far away. She closed her eyes and said in a hoarse voice, "I want to eat teriyaki chicken, Manchuhan Imperial Feast, sushi pizza, barbecued pork dumplings, salmon." The man quietly listened to her. "You can eat after your fever subsides. Right now you can only eat bland food." Hearing this, Jinwan lifted the quilt to cover her head. She said impatiently, "Then I won't eat." She then turned to lie down on the bed and leave the man's embrace. However, just as she was about to roll onto the bed, the man easily pulled her back and forced her to sit on the bed. "If you don't eat, do you plan to maintain this state when you wake up tomorrow morning? You can't even sit up?" Jinwan sat up with the man's help and immediately said angrily, "There's no taste in my mouth. I don't want to eat such bland food." The man nodded. Just as Jinwan was about to lie back on the bed, he leaned down and kissed her hot lips. Jinwan suddenly shivered and pushed him with all her strength. However, she only managed to push the man's lips away by a finger's length. She was about to argue with him angrily when the man lowered his head and kissed her again. Jinwan trembled for several seconds. The man held the back of her head and did not restrain himself despite her resistance. Instead, the kiss deepened. Their lips and tongues intertwined. Especially when she was sober and not drunk, she could easily recall the scenes from last night. Her scalp instantly turned numb. She had no strength to push him away. In the end, she was forced to raise her head to receive the man's kiss. Her fingers involuntarily tightened around the man's clothes. Just as she was in a daze, the man released the back of her head and stopped the kiss. Just as Jinwan was about to fall back weakly, he held her waist and held her in his arms. Jinwan had yet to react when the man casually said, "Still bland. Jinwan, I'll carry you over." "Mo Jingshan, I'm not wearing any clothes." Just as the man's hand was about to pull her out of the blanket, Jinwan hurriedly tightened her grip on the blanket. The man paused for a moment before getting up to retrieve a loose and easy-to-wear blouse from the suitcase she had left in the room. He came back and helped her put it on. Only then did she release the quilt that she had been clutching tightly to. The man buttoned the blouse for her one by one and then carried her horizontally. When she was carried to the table where the dinner was placed, Mo Jingshan placed her on the sofa closest to him, asking, "What do you want to eat?" Jinwan did not speak. She only glanced at the dishes on the table before looking at the vegetable porridge and tofu soup. The man did not ask further and placed the two dishes she had been staring at in front of her. He originally wanted to hand her the cutlery, but when he saw her leaning against the sofa weakly as though she had no bones, he picked it up and scooped it up with a spoon, bringing it to her lips. "Open your mouth." Jinwan originally did not want to cooperate, but she did need strength. She could not continue wasting time like this. Furthermore, Mo Jingshan had ignored her cries and begging last night and had been beastly. Right now, even if he were to serve her while she ate, it would not be too much. Thus, Jinwan opened her mouth and swallowed the vegetable porridge with a hint of vengeance. Her gaze was still cold and hateful as she stared at the man in front of her. Yet, when this man was serving her while she ate, he sat by her side with his back straight, elegant and stern. His cold-toned shirt was immaculate, and his movements were so natural that it made her feel as though she was a small animal he was personally feeding. Small animal? Chapter 595. Mo Jingshan did not expose the little woman's vengeful and angry thoughts. When she received the bowl and obediently lowered her head to eat, his lips curved slightly. His tone did not change as he said, "Eat, it's not hot anymore." Jinwan did not speak, lowering her head to focus on eating. After eating before she could speak, the man had already carried her back to the bed. This kind of carrying, Jinwan's throat felt uncomfortable. She coughed and did not speak. She sat on the bed and remembered her phone. "Mo Jingshan, bring my bag over." Hearing the woman's commanding tone, the man only took a deep look at her. He took the bag and handed it to her without a word. Jinwan unzipped it and took out her phone. She saw that there was only 4% battery left. She was about to charge it when she unlocked the phone and saw several missed calls. Some of them were from the driver from last night. She had originally arranged for the driver to bring her back to the hotel, but in the end she drank too much and was brought away by Mo Jingshan from the club. The driver had not been able to contact her. It was likely that after asking the others and learning that she had left, he left. She couldn't have caused him to wait outside for an entire night, right? As Jinwan pondered, she looked at the other missed calls. They were all from her colleagues. Aside from those she knew, only the company would call her. After hurriedly returning a few calls to her colleagues and the driver, Jinwan raised her hand to touch her head. It seemed like it was still burning and there were no signs of perspiration. Finally, when she returned the call to Xiao Ba's nagging voice could be heard from the phone. "Boss, why did you only receive news now? From this morning until now, you haven't replied to any of my calls or WeChat messages. You've really made me anxious. If I had known, I wouldn't have let you go to Jing City alone. I would have been more at ease if I followed you." Jinwan lowered her eyes and calmly replied, "What's wrong? Why are there so many urgent matters?" "Actually, it's not that urgent. It's just that Mr. Zan came over from London. It's been several months since our company moved back to the country, but Mr. Zan hasn't come over to take a look. This time he came to discuss business and dropped by High City, but you weren't here." "He just dropped by High City to take a look, or did he specially come to find me?" "It should be along the way, but didn't you always say that Mr. Zand is your master? When we first went to London he was the one who took you with him. I thought you'd feel sorry for missing out on his trip to Sea City. What's there to feel pity about? I haven't seen him look for me many times in the past 2 years in London. He has invested in many companies under his name and personally led them. He is my teacher, but his students are all over the world. What's more, when I wanted to look for him, he was wandering around in other countries and had no time to deal with me. Now he probably has some business to discuss in Sea City, so he came to see me. If he can't see me, then so be it. I don't think he will stay for long." "You were right. After learning that you weren't in Sea City, Mr. Zand left not long after. He didn't tell us to pass you a message. It seems like he was just passing by." Jinwan chuckled. This kind of busy person who flies all over the world, if he doesn't have a goal, he basically doesn't have time to sit around. I think he saw that MN Group has officially moved back to the country and wants to discuss some cooperation with me in the country. Then you don't plan on working with Mr. Zand anymore? It depends on his sincerity. If he really wants to talk, he will call me later or come to High City to look for me, Jinwan said mildly. Jinwan said indifferently and looked up to see that Mo Jingshan was still looking at her, as if he was simply judging her attitude toward the company and her words and actions from the conversation she had on the phone. After speaking a few more words with Xiao Ba, she hung up. At the same time she was about to charge her phone, but her charging cable was by the sofa. She directly handed her phone to Mo Jingshan. "Help me charge it." Her tone was still arrogant and bossy. The man took another look at her matter-of-fact attitude and accepted it. He turned to help her charge it, and at the same time, lifted his lips to speak mildly. "Mr. Zand is an excellent corporate architect and financial analyst in England. In recent years, under his guidance, there have been many successful companies that have gradually entered the business circle. Your company is one of them. However, it's clear that MN Group is the only Chinese company that he has supported. You haven't let him down. In his eyes, you have a lot of potential. If he still wants to cooperate with you in the future, just accept it." After Mo Jingshan finished speaking, the air suddenly fell into a strange silence. Jinwan sat on the bed and was about to lift the blanket to cover her legs when she suddenly paused. Her gaze shifted to the man who had just placed her phone on the table along with the charging cable. She watched his tall and straight back as he straightened up. 3 years ago, Mr. Zand had visited High City and suddenly extended an olive branch to her studio. He said that many of her business concepts, ideas, as well as her foresight towards property and other industries were very optimistic. After that, he had a long discussion with her, saying that he would help her remodel her studio and that he could help her build a business empire. At the time, Jinwan felt that this person was just boasting and did not pay much attention to him. Later on, when her heart was like dead ashes and she decided to leave, she did not know what she was thinking. She suddenly thought of Mr. Zand and decided to give it a try in London. At the time, she only thought that another business partner had introduced her to Mr. Zand. She had never thought otherwise. For someone of Mr. Zand's status, he was someone who had reached the acme of perfection in the eyes of many new companies. How could he possibly favor a small studio like hers? Did you arrange for Mr. Zand to come over? The matter of him bringing me to England was also arranged by you long ago? Jinwan abruptly asked. The man saw that she was about to lie down in that light-colored smock. The smock was made of linen, so it wasn't comfortable to lie down and sleep in it. He casually went to her suitcase to help her find her pajamas. At the same time he said faintly, "This kind of corporate creator who flies around Tian'an High City would obediently accompany you for a year. Is it hard to guess the reason behind this?" Jinwan. Chapter 596. Thus, whether it was helping her or watching her grow up when she encountered difficulties, but when she needed support he invested a sum of money in her. Although he appeared to be a very realistic and cold-blooded person, he had only done so to train her. Thus, from the beginning until now, every step she had taken in the past 3 years had been within Mo Jingshan's plans. There was not a single mistake. So, Mr. Zand, her so-called teacher, the person who helped her build the MN group, had been arranged by her side by Mo Jingshan's side? Jinwan only felt that a certain understanding was about to collapse from her mind. Some things that had been confusing her seemed to gradually become clear in her mind. Her lips moved before she asked in disbelief, "So, in the past 3 years, you know everything that happened to me in England?" The man brought out her pajamas and came over to help her change into them. Jinwan did not have the strength to struggle. In any case, struggling was useless. She allowed the man to take off her blouse and help her put on her pajamas. At the same time, he tucked her shoulder-length hair out to prevent it from being uncomfortable in the pajamas. Jinwan raised her chin, still looking at the man's perfectly curved jaw. "Mo Jingshan, explain it to me clearly." The man looked at her, his hand still resting on the end of her hair. His long, slender fingers moved through her hair. "If I could really control many things, I wouldn't have to force you to divorce and force you to leave with a cold heart to solve all of this. There are always things that I can't fight against myself." Jinwan looked at him and did not speak. The man's hand landed on her back, seemingly comforting her gently and confirming the thoughts in her heart. His voice was quiet and indifferent. "During the 3 years you were in London, although it was my arrangement, I didn't interfere in anything, nor did I try to find out. The only thing I did was to hand you over to someone who I could let go of in peace before you left." Jinwan looked at the man's handsome and deep face. For a moment she did not know how to describe such a man. He could quietly devise strategies under the seemingly supercilious state. He could have strong self-control and motivation to save her life. He could also make her believe that he really didn't love her when he should have made her believe that he really didn't love her. Now, when he wanted to get her back, he made her realize that this man's thoughts were deeper than the sea. It turned out that there were so many things she didn't know about him. It seemed that from the beginning she did not know anything. She could be willful, she could act recklessly, she could take revenge because of hatred, she could grow up, she could do whatever she wanted. She thought she was already very successful, but when she did not know anything, he knew everything. Jinwan pursed her lips and did not speak for a long time. Seeing her dark eyes, the man placed his hand on her forehead and then on her neck. "It's still very hot. When you were unconscious, your temperature only dropped to 38.7 degrees. Now, I'm afraid it's still not lower than 38 degrees. Take your temperature again. If it still doesn't drop, I'll find a way to lower your temperature." With that, the man moved his hand away from her neck. However, Jinwan sat motionless on the bed, staring blankly at the buttons on his chest and said hoarsely, "Mo Jingshan." Hearing the emotion in her voice, Mo Jingshan took a look at her. He did not respond, but he did not walk away either. Jinwan slowly raised her eyes. Her eyes were red and tears were rolling in them. After a long time she said, You're too scary. The man narrowed his eyes at her complicated emotions. Before he spoke, Jinwan suddenly grabbed the pillow on the bed and slammed it against him. She did not scold him anymore but bit her lip hard and slammed the pillow against his face, chest and shoulders. If she really wanted to hit him, she wouldn't have used the pillow, but she used it. Obviously, she needed to vent her anger, but she didn't want to hit him too hard. Mo Jingshan stood by the bed and did not move, allowing her to attack him with the pillow. He allowed her eyes to turn redder and redder, and her tears to fall more and more fiercely. It was hard to tell whether her eyes were filled with love or hate. Perhaps there were both. She loved everything he had done for her, loved him from the beginning to the present, and hated his strong, calm and terrifying self-control. She hated him for dragging her from heaven to hell as if nothing had happened when she lost her child. People were most afraid of love and hate, but she had experienced it. People were most afraid of living for too long only to fall for the same person, but she had experienced it too. She was tired from hitting him, but she still forcefully threw the pillow at him. The sturdy white pillow in the hotel was almost deformed by her hands. She didn't know whether she used more strength to hit him or to pinch the pillow. She only knew that she had nowhere to express her feelings. If she didn't vent them, she would really explode. Jinwan. Seeing that she was tired, Mo Jingshan lowered his eyes to look at the woman's red eyes and messy hair, calling her name in a low voice. Jinwan didn't seem to hear him, but she seemed to hear him, because she suddenly increased her strength and slammed the pillow against his face. The man abruptly tugged the pillow that she had been clenching tightly against and reached out to pull her into his arms. Jinwan's hands were empty and without warning she hit his chin, but she didn't even stop. She struggled with all her might in his arms, punching and kicking. Her hands kept hitting his neck, his shoulders, his chin and even his face. Although her manicured nails didn't scratch his face, they still left several red marks on the side of the man's face. Her tears soaked the front of his shirt, and Mo Jingshan asked her to calm down several times, but she didn't seem to hear him and continued to slap him. The man abruptly lowered his head and kissed her tear-stained and salty lips. He pressed her harshly against the bed, suppressing her body that had been moving non-stop. He locked her in place with absolute strength until she gradually fell limp under him. She stopped moving but stared at him with reddened eyes filled with resentment. The man finally sighed softly against her lips and kissed her cheeks, eyes, kissing away the salty wetness on her face. "All right, I only ate a few mouthfuls. If you keep tormenting me like this, it'll be digested in no time. If you're sick, you have to act like you're sick. After the fever goes down, I'll stand still and let you hit me, en?" The man's hand caressed her face, pushing aside the hair stuck to it. Chapter 597. Jinwan raised her hand to hit his face again. This time, the man held her wrist, lowered his eyes and pressed his body against hers, staring at her. "Look at you. Are you going to use all your energy and strength to hit me for the rest of your life?" The man's voice was light and indifferent, without the slightest sense of irritation like hers. It was as if he was simply asking her what she wanted to eat tomorrow. Jinwan's lips trembled in anger, but she could not speak. After a long time she could only squeeze out a few words. "You're too scary." Mo Jingshan slightly curved his lips. "I'll take that as a compliment." She turned her head away abruptly, refusing to look at the man's infuriating smile. She never expected that everything she had experienced in the past 3 years, including her struggles, changes and growth, was all under his control. She thought she had already soared, but it turned out that he was the one who held her back. Jinwan wriggled in his arms again. Her tears had dried up, but they were still red. Her fever had not subsided, and her cheeks were also red. She looked as if she was about to be cooked. The man gently touched her hair and rubbed it comfortingly. "All right, don't make trouble. I think you've used up most of your strength." He had guessed correctly. Jinwan didn't know where the strength came from. She hit him crazily for a long time, but most of her strength was used on the pillow. At this moment, her whole body was sore and soft. She could not even lift her arms. She could only move her body faintly, but because their bodies were so close together, she could feel the changes in the man's lower body with every movement. When she felt that her lower abdomen was being rubbed by him, Jinwan immediately glared at him fiercely. "Shameless, dirty bastard. I'm already like this, but you're still hard." The man was still thinking about how to coax her, but he was instantly amused by this woman's words. He looked at her deeply and rubbed her hair patiently. "I thought you knew my desire for you last night. It's been more than 3 years. Do you think it can be filled in one night?" Jinwan was expressionless, but her eyes and face were red. Even if she was expressionless, she did not look so cold. In his eyes she looked cute. The smile in the man's eyes grew wider. You don't know how much restraint I had to use to endure it after having sex last night. If you hadn't fainted from the fever today, I would have used another method to make you lie in bed for a day and a night, crying until you couldn't find your voice. Jinwan, she frowned. Don't press down on me. Get up. The more he lay on top of her, the more she moved, the more dangerous she was. In her current state, she definitely couldn't take another round. No more? The man asked in a low voice. Jinwan closed her eyes and turned away. I don't have the strength. Her answer was ambiguous, but the gist of it was that if she still had the strength, she might do it again. The man smiled, patting her head as though he was playing with a child. He then released her and stood up. At the same time, he glanced at the hair and sweat on Jinwan's forehead, saying, It's not like all this was useless. At the very least, the sweat finally came out. Jinwan was startled. She raised her hand to touch her head. As expected, she was sweating. This meant that her fever would go down soon. Jinwan did not move anymore. She turned around on the bed and closed her eyes to rest. Seeing that she was sweating more and more, it seemed like her fever was really going to go down. Mo Jingshin turned to the bathroom to prepare a bath for her. Several minutes later, the man came out to see that Jinwan was still lying in the middle of the bed with her eyes closed. She was not using a pillow as a pillow and was lying there quietly. It was clear that she had not fallen asleep. You sweated for a while. After your fever goes down, go take a bath. The water is ready. Jinwan ignored Mo Jingshin's words and did not move from the bed. She was indeed not asleep. Earlier on, when Mo Jingshin was in the bathroom, she kept her eyes open to look out the window. When she heard him come out, she closed her eyes again. At this moment she was sweating non-stop. The pajamas that the man had just forced her to change into were instantly soaked with sweat. He didn't know how serious her fever was for the whole day. She finally sweated, but in the end she sweated so much. Mo Jingshin watched as the little woman lay there motionlessly, drenched in sweat. Mo Jingshin walked over, placing his hand on her sweaty forehead and touching her flushed face. Jinwan did not move, nor did she avoid his hand. She only opened her eyes to look out the window, refusing to look at him. Her temper was quite bad. Mo Jingshin asked softly, Should I carry you to take a bath? She still did not move. This time she turned her face even further away. She did not even want to look at him from the corner of her eyes. The man casually picked up the electronic thermometer by the bedside and measured her temperature. As expected, after sweating, her temperature had dropped significantly. Right now it was only 37.2 degrees. He placed the thermometer down, his long arms directly carrying the woman who looked as though she had just been fished out of the water due to her sweat. Before Jinwan could struggle, the man had already carried her to the bedside. Furthermore, he did not mind her sweat at all. His hand gently patted her back through her damp pajamas. Even if you want to throw a tantrum, you have to choose the right time. Jinwan did not want to pay attention to him. She did not want to speak to him. Just looking at him made her angry. Seeing her uncooperative expression, Mo Jingshin did not let go of her. He unhurriedly placed her on his lap, encircling her in his embrace. At the same time, the man's low and heavy voice rang above Jinwan's head. Tell me, what do I have to do to appease your anger? Jinwan could not tell if she was angry or something else. It was just that there were many things that she could not immediately digest. But he had never told her any of this. He had always kept it a secret. It was as though her every conscious or unconscious decision and action were all predicted by him. Right now, she did not have the strength to struggle against him. However, being held in his arms, she raised her eyes to see the man's calm and indifferent expression. It was as though no matter what he did, he was always right. It was as though everything was within his expectations, including her every emotion. Right now, she was like an insensible little woman throwing a tantrum. Her hair stood on end in his arms. Mo Jingshin, have you ever thought about my feelings? Chapter 598. Right now, Jinwan's attitude toward him was exactly the same as that day when she coldly said she no longer loved him. It was as though he was dispensable and she did not care about anything. She had her own temper, but it was not big. She only harbored some thoughts of revenge and always wanted to stab a knife into his heart. However, it was rare to see her so angry when she threw the pillow at him. I don't need you to accommodate me. Move your hand away. No matter what she said, he had no intention of letting go. Jinwan wanted to twist out of his arms, but she remembered that the man couldn't take any teasing right now. If she moved around in his arms like this, it would only do her no good. In the end, her expression turned ugly. I'm all sweaty. Even if you don't dislike me, you still dislike me. Let me take a shower. You still have strength? I'll carry you over? No need. I can do it myself. Mo Jingshan lowered his gaze to look at her sweaty little face and then at her furrowed brows. In the end, he still released her. After Jinwan got off the bed, perhaps because her fever was no longer as bad, although she had used up most of her strength, she did not feel as dizzy as before. She steadied herself and went straight into the bathroom. Amidst the rising steam in the bathroom, Jinwan raised her hand to scratch at her similarly sweaty hair. She glanced at the bathtub that Mo Jingshan had filled with water and bent down to sit by the bathtub. She stared at the water in a daze for a while. Finally, the man suddenly knocked on the bathroom door. His low voice was calm yet somewhat warning. I want you to go in and take a shower, not hide from me. If I don't hear anything for more than 5 minutes, I'll go in at any time. Jinwan removed her sweaty pajamas and threw them onto the washing rack by the side. She then entered the water and sat down in the bathtub. She did not have any strength, but she did not need to wash herself in this bathtub. She only needed to sit in it, and the jacuzzi that came with this kind of star hotel would have the function of taking a bath. The water pressure from all directions washed her body rhythmically. From time to time, some white bubbles would bubble up. Soon the entire bathtub became like a bubble bath. Jinwan just lay motionless in the bathroom, letting herself be washed clean. She looked up at the light in the bathroom. In the end, the bath was so comfortable that she almost fell asleep. About 2 minutes after she closed her eyes, there was another knock on the bathroom door, and the man's deep voice rang out. Don't sleep in there. Jinwan, did he install a surveillance camera in the bathroom? How could he predict everything she did? She had chosen this hotel to stay in. After Mo Jingshan brought her back from the club yesterday, this was the first time she had stayed here. It was unlikely that there would be any surveillance cameras. Jinwan's gaze instinctively scanned the bathroom once. She then changed the bathtub's water and washed for a while before getting up. However, when she lowered her head, she saw that even though she had bathed several times, the marks on her body were still very obvious. She really could not figure out how perverted Mo Jingshan was last night. From head to toe, he really kissed her all over without missing an inch. And it was while she was still unconscious from the fever. Jinwan pulled a long face and stepped out of the bathtub. With one foot in the bathroom slippers, she took a step forward with the other and reached out for the towel on the silver metal rack. However, her feet suddenly slipped, and she abruptly fell to the ground with a thud. Thankfully, her reaction was fast. Instead of falling straight down, she twisted her body slightly and landed on her bottom. Ah! Almost at the moment when Jinwan gave a low cry of pain, the bathroom door was quickly opened from the outside by the man. As soon as Mo Jingshan entered the door, he saw Jinwan sitting on the ground naked with a pale face. She looked as if she had fallen on her butt. The man quickly walked over and bent down to carry her up. However, Jinwan held her bottom with one hand and pointed upward with the other. Towel, give me a towel. Mo Jingshan casually tugged down a towel and wrapped it around her body. In an instant he helped her up. How are you? Did you fall badly? How could you fall after taking a bath? Jinwan also wanted to ask if she and Mo Jingshan had a mutual nemesis. Why did she not do so many embarrassing things in the past few years in London? Her days were peaceful, but the moment she was in front of him, she would either have a fever or fall. Was this man his nemesis? Earlier there was too much foam in the bathtub and it flowed out. I didn't notice. I didn't expect the floor to be so slippery, Jinwan explained. Her hand was still held behind her. Her expression changed from one of anger to one of awkwardness and grievance. Seeing that she still had the mood to put on an expression, it was likely that her fall was not serious. Mo Jingshan carried her up, walked out of the bathroom and placed her on the bed. The moment Jinwan's bottom touched the bed, she shifted back slightly and wrapped the towel that she had casually wrapped around her body. However, the towel was only so big. It could only cover her from her chest down, neck, collarbone, shoulders and chest. The marks left by the man last night, as well as her pale rosy skin from soaking in the bath for too long, were all exposed to the man's eyes. Jinwan was stared at by the man for a moment. She abruptly pointed at her luggage. Help me bring another set of pajamas. The man glanced at the bathrobe she was wearing. How many sets of pajamas did you bring over? Mo Jingshan immediately smiled. The remaining set is the pink halter top nightgown. The moment Jean Wan recalled the style of that nightgown, she immediately fell silent. Last time at Xingtang Hotel, he almost couldn't control himself when he saw her in her nightgown. If it weren't for her period, he would have eaten her up that night. But that day wasn't much better. Her hands were sore for a long time before they were relieved. From the way I see it, there's no difference whether you wear it or not. But it was still better than being wrapped in a towel that barely covered her thighs. Bring it. I want to wear it. Mo Jingshan did not say more. If she wanted to wear it, he would let her wear it. He continued to search for pajamas in her luggage without any complaints. Finally, he brought out the soft pink silk nightgown and brought it back to the bed. I'll help you wear it? I'll do it myself. Jean Wan raised her hand. Mo Jingshan handed the nightgown to her. After receiving it, Jean Wan lifted the blankets and changed into the nightgown. The man's dark eyes watched as the little woman hid under the blankets to change into the nightgown. When she put down the blankets, the pink halter top fell into his eyes. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.